I should have seen it coming when my sister stood up at Thanksgiving dinner, hands trembling with what I thought was emotion. But it wasn't sadness in her eyes, it was triumph. "We took a vote," Kayla announced, her voice cutting through the warmth of turkey and family laughter. "You're no longer welcome at any family gatherings. Effective immediately." The room erupted. Applause. Actual applause. 7 hands had risen against me, people I'd sacrificed everything, for people whose bills I'd paid, whose mistakes I'd covered, whose lives I'd held together with my own bleeding hands for 15 years. My parents sat silent, refusing to meet my eyes. My sister's fiancé smirked like he'd just won a game I didn't know we were playing. They expected tears, begging. The same pattern I'd followed my entire life, silent, accommodating, eternally forgiving Miranda, who always bent but never broke. Instead, I smiled. "Perfect," I said, reaching into my bag. "Then I guess you won't be needing this." I placed a thick manila folder on the table between the mashed potatoes and the lies. The room went still. Kayla snatched it, tore it open, and the color drained from her face like water from a broken glass. Her hands shook as she flipped through pages. Bank statements, contracts, recordings, evidence of things they thought I'd never discover, crimes they thought I'd never document. And then she screamed, because what they didn't know was that I'd spent 18 months preparing for this exact moment. And by the time this Thanksgiving dinner ends, they'll learn that the quiet sister they dismissed had been building a case that would destroy them all. What was in that folder? Stay until the end, because this is only the beginning. My name is Miranda Shaw. I'm 36 years old, a certified public accountant who built her own financial consulting firm from scratch, and for most of my life I believed that love meant sacrifice. I thought being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always showed up, meant I'd earned a permanent place at this table. I was wrong. The Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house in suburban Illinois had started like every other year, the smell of roasted turkey mixing with Mom's famous sage stuffing, the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking its steady rhythm, the sound of football announcers murmuring from the TV in the den. 12 of us gathered around the dining table that had been in our family for 3 generations, the white linen tablecloth crisp and perfect, the good china reflecting candlelight. Everything looked warm. Everything looked right. But I'd learned a long time ago that appearances and truth don't always share the same address. I was halfway through my mashed potatoes when my sister Kayla stood up. Not the casual half-rise to reach for the gravy boat, but a full stand chair scraping deliberately against hardwood. She cleared her throat like someone about to make a toast. The conversations around the table died in sections, Uncle Jim mid-sentence about his new truck. Aunt Susan's laugh cutting off abruptly, my cousin's fork hovering between plate and mouth. "I have an announcement," Kayla said, and her voice had that particular quality I'd heard before, the tone she used when she'd rehearsed something, practiced it in mirrors, until the words came out smooth and certain. She was 32 but looked younger in her carefully chosen cream sweater, her blonde hair falling in those effortless waves that actually took 45 minutes with a curling iron. Her fiancé Trent sat beside her, his hand resting on the table in a way that seemed supportive but looked more like a handler keeping his client on script. "We've been talking," Kayla continued, and her eyes swept the room but never quite landed on me. "As a family, and we took a vote." She paused and I watched her hand rise like she was taking an oath in court, fingers straight, palm facing out. "You're no longer invited to any family events. Any of them. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. For a split second I thought I'd misheard. Then the laughter started. Not uncomfortable chuckling, but actual laughter. My cousin Derek grinned like someone had told a joke he'd been waiting for. Uncle Jim nodded slowly as if this made perfect sense. And then the applause came, scattered at first, then building. 7 people raised their hands in agreement, one by one, like jurors delivering a unanimous verdict. I watched it happen in fragments, the way you see a car accident in slow motion. Aunt Susan's hand went up tentatively, her eyes darting to Kayla for approval. Derek's hand shot up confidently. Even Aunt Ruth, who I had always thought understood me better than the rest, kept her hands in her lap, but pulled her phone out, holding it low recording. Dad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, refusing to raise his hand, but also refusing to look at me. Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, but her hand stayed down too. Their silence felt worse than the votes against me. The room had transformed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Glasses that had been raised in casual conversation now sat motionless condensation running down their sides. Forks hovered in midair as people froze watching. The grandfather clock's tick, usually buried under the noise of family gathering, suddenly became the loudest sound in the room, each second marked and measured like a countdown. Kayla was still standing, and I could see it now. This wasn't spontaneous emotion. This was a performance. The way she held her shoulders back, the way her voice projected just slightly louder than necessary, the way Trent's hand moved to her lower back in a gesture that looked like support, but felt like direction. They'd planned this, rehearsed it, probably multiple times, getting the timing right, making sure the words landed with maximum impact. They expected tears. They expected me to shrink, to apologize, to ask what I'd done wrong so they could list my failures one by one, while I absorbed the punishment the way I'd absorbed everything else for the past 15 years. They expected the Miranda. They knew the one who stayed quiet, who fixed problems without acknowledgement, who carried weight without complaint. Instead, I smiled. Not a big smile, not theatrical. Just a small upturn at the corners of my mouth that didn't quite reach my eyes. I set my fork down carefully, precisely the way I'd been trained to set down a pen after signing an important document. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Then I reached into the leather bag I'd kept beside my chair, the bag they probably assumed held my phone and keys and wallet, the ordinary contents of an ordinary person's ordinary life. I pulled out a burgundy manila folder thick enough that it bent slightly under its own weight, sealed with evidence tape across the closure. The kind of tape that shows if it's been tampered with, the kind used in legal proceedings. I held it for just a moment, feeling its heft, and then placed it in the center of the table between the serving dishes. "Perfect," I said, and my voice came out steady, almost clinical, the voice I used when presenting financial reports to clients. "Then I guess you won't need this." The folder sat there on the white tablecloth like a blood stain on snow, dark against light, impossible to ignore. Every eye in the room locked onto it. The laughter died completely. Someone's breath caught audibly. I didn't move to open it. Didn't explain it. Didn't make threats or speeches. I just sat there, back straight, hands folded on the table in front of me, and waited. Kayla's confidence flickered. Just for a second, I saw uncertainty cross her face before the performance snapped back into place. Trent leaned forward slightly, his practiced real estate agent smile faltering at the edges. Dad's arms uncrossed. Mom's dabbing stopped. Kayla reached for the folder like it might bite her. Her manicured nails picked at the evidence tape, tearing it slowly. The sound was loud in the silence, that specific ripping noise that says something is being opened that was meant to stay closed. She lifted the cover. Papers spilled out across the table, sliding between serving dishes. Bank statements with transactions highlighted in yellow. Receipts dated and organized chronologically. Copies of checks with signatures magnified to show discrepancies. Contracts with altered dates circled in red. Photographs printed on glossy paper. Notarized documents with official seals. 5 years of meticulous documentation, every page labeled, every number cross-referenced, every claim backed by evidence that couldn't be argued with or explained away. The color drained from Kayla's face like someone had pulled a plug. She grabbed the first page, her hands shaking as she speed-read. I watched her eyes move, tracking left to right, then down, then her whole body going rigid. A spoon clattered against china. Someone's hand had slipped, nerveless. The metallic ring cut through the silence like a bell marking the end of something. Trent leaned over Kayla's shoulder, reading over her arm. His smile cracked like ice under weight. His jaw tightened. Someone's chair scraped backward. I think it was Derek putting distance between himself and whatever bomb had just been armed. Uncle Jim's face went from smug confidence to confusion to something that might have been fear. Kayla flipped to the second page, then the third faster, now her breathing shallow. The papers trembled in her grip. She made a sound not quite a word, more like air being forced from lungs. And then she screamed. Not a scream of anger. A scream of someone who'd just seen the ground open beneath them. And I just sat there, fingers still interlaced, watching the chaos I'd carefully constructed unfold exactly as I'd designed it to. Patient. Calm. Already 10 steps ahead while they were still trying to understand step 1. Because in one breath, in one awful crystallizing moment, they realized I was no longer someone they could dismiss. I suppose it's strange to say that watching my sister scream while holding evidence of her own betrayal felt like an ending. But really it was just the moment when everything I'd carried for 23 years finally became visible. The weight had always been there. People just hadn't been looking. It started when I was 13 and Mom's body began failing in ways that required surgery after surgery. Ovarian cysts, then a hysterectomy, then complications that brought her back to the hospital 3 more times that year. Dad worked long hours at the plant overtime whenever he could get it, and someone had to keep the house running. That someone was me. I learned to cook by reading the recipe cards Mom kept in a wooden box on the counter, her handwriting looping across index cards stained with decades of use. Meatloaf on Mondays, chicken casserole on Wednesdays, spaghetti on Fridays. I stood on a step stool to reach the stove and learned that browning meat requires patience, that pasta water should taste like the sea, that love can be measured in meals no one remembers eating. I kept a budget spreadsheet in a notebook I'd bought at the drugstore with my babysitting money. Income on the left, expenses on the right, running total at the bottom. Dad gave me cash each week for groceries, and I learned to make it stretch, learned which stores had sales, on which days learned that store-brand crackers taste the same as name-brand, if you don't think about it too hard. I coordinated Kayla's pickups from elementary school, making sure she got to dance class on Tuesdays and Girl Scouts on Thursdays, that her permission slips were signed and her lunch money was ready in an envelope each Monday morning. Kayla was 8 that year, still young enough to be the family's bright spot, the one thing that hadn't gone wrong. She had Mom's blonde hair and Dad's easy smile, and everyone treated her like sunshine in human form. Cheerleading came naturally. Homecoming court in high school felt inevitable. When college applications came around, I proofread every essay, caught every typo, made sure her scholarship paperwork went in on time. I told myself I was helping. I didn't realize I was teaching her that my labor was invisible, that some people worked while others were worked for, and that this was simply how the world divided itself. Dad's advice was always the same. Be tough, Miranda. Life doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you can handle. So I became tough. I developed armor made of competence and silence, the kind that doesn't show cracks, even when you're breaking underneath. On the nights when I cried into my pillow, exhausted from a full day of school, followed by cooking and cleaning and budgeting and organizing, I made sure no one heard. Because being tough meant bearing weight alone. It meant not asking for help or acknowledgement. It meant understanding that my love language was action, paying bills, fixing problems, showing up even when my family's love language seemed to be words they never actually said to me. No one said thank you. No one said I see you. No one said what you're doing matters. The imbalance started innocent enough, born from genuine need during a genuine crisis. But crisis became routine, and routine became expectation, and expectation calcified into something I couldn't chip away, no matter how much I accomplished. Adult life didn't change the pattern, it just raised the stakes. I became a CPA because numbers made sense in ways people didn't. Numbers balanced, or they didn't. Numbers told the truth, even when mouths lied. I passed my certification exam on the first try, started working for a firm downtown, and within 6 years, I'd saved enough to start my own financial consulting business. Small at first, just me and a part-time assistant. But it grew because I understood something fundamental. People want someone they can trust with their money, and I'd been trustworthy since I was 13 years old. The money I made went to my family as naturally as water flows downhill. Mom's hospital bills from her ongoing health issues piled up even with insurance, so I paid them. $87,000 over 4 years transferred quietly from my business account to the hospital's billing department. When Dad's air conditioning died during a July heat wave, I paid for the replacement unit. $4,500 so he could sleep without sweating through his sheets. When Kayla's credit cards maxed out once in her 20s again, at 28 a third time at 30, I cleared them. $23,000 total spread across 3 bailouts each time, accompanied by her tearful promise that it wouldn't happen again. I never received real thanks. Just assumptions that I'd always be there, always catch them like a faucet that runs forever because no one's ever seen plumbing fail. I was infrastructure, not a person. Necessary but invisible. Expected but not appreciated. Everything changed in 2016 when a college friend I'd trusted asked me to co-sign a business loan. He had a great pitch, solid projections, promises that felt real because I wanted them to be. I signed. He forged my signature on additional documents I'd never seen, took out credit in my name, and disappeared when the payments came due. It took me 18 months and $12,000 to clean up that mess, and when it was over, I made myself a promise never again would I sign anything without documentation. Never again would I trust without verification. Illinois is a one-party consent state, which means I could legally record any conversation I was part of. So I started. A small digital recorder I kept in my purse activated whenever anyone in my family wanted to discuss money or favors or anything that might need remembering later. I photocopied every check before mailing it. I saved every text message, every email, every receipt. Not because I was paranoid, because I'd learned that people's memories become selective when accountability arrives and numbers don't lie even when everyone around them does. My philosophy became my prison: keep family together through actions, not words. Stay quiet, stay helpful, stay essential. But invisible labor doesn't make you valued, it makes you the floor everyone walks on without looking down. I learned to swallow small injustices, telling myself that peace was worth the cost of silence. But peace built on one person's swallowing isn't peace at all. It's just endurance dressed up in prettier clothes. I told myself that being needed meant being loved. That if I could just be indispensable enough, eventually they'd see my worth. But by Thanksgiving 2024, sitting at that table with 7 hands raised against me, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding for decades. They didn't need me. They needed my resources, my signature, my silence, my willingness to be used. There's a difference between being essential and being expendable, and I'd confused the two for most of my life. And then, one night, 3 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, they asked me to sign something I could never forgive. They called it a family meeting, which should have been my first warning. In our family meetings meant decisions had already been made, and I was being invited to rubber stamp them with my signature and my silence. This one happened on a Tuesday evening in August, 3 months before that Thanksgiving dinner. They arrived at my house at 7 o'clock, Mom, Dad, Kayla, and Trent, her fiancé of 6 months who I'd met exactly twice before and didn't trust for reasons I couldn't yet articulate. My dining room had hosted countless family meals over the years. I'd bought the oak table specifically because it was large enough for everyone, because I'd imagined holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sundays where we'd gather and belong to each other in ways that felt real. The evening sun came through the windows at an angle that made the wood glow warm, and I'd set out water glasses and notepads like this was a business consultation because that's what my instincts told me this would become. Trent took the lead immediately, which should have been my second warning. He was 34, handsome in that practiced way of men who've learned to weaponize charm with real estate credentials, and a smile that looked expensive because it probably was veneers whitening the works. He'd brought a laptop and a folder of his own glossy printouts that he spread across my table like a card dealer showing a winning hand. "Miranda, we're here to talk about the future." He began, his voice smooth as showroom floors. Kayla's future specifically. and how this family can come together to support something really special. He clicked his laptop and a slide appeared projected against my cream-colored wall because he'd brought a mini projector too. The presentation was titled, May's Place a Boutique Vision. My grandmother's name deployed like a weapon in the first 30 seconds. Grandma May had died 8 months earlier, and we were all still tender from it. Using her name for Kayla's business idea wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Trent knew exactly what he was doing. He painted a picture of sister entrepreneurship Kayla's boutique becoming an Instagram destination, a place where women could find unique clothing and feel empowered by supporting a local female business owner. His words came fast and smooth, each sentence calculated to hit emotional targets. He talked about family legacy, about Grandma May's independent spirit, about how proud she'd be to see Kayla building something of her own. He threw in phrases like, empowering women business owners, while his eyes slid toward me with something that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't quite respect either, implying without saying that my corporate consulting work was somehow less authentic than a boutique selling imported scarves. The air conditioning hummed its steady rhythm, but the room felt like it was shrinking. Every sentence Trent spoke seemed to take up more oxygen, leaving less for questions or objections or anything that might interrupt his momentum. I felt it tightening around me, this financial noose dressed up as opportunity, as family support, as the loving thing a good sister would obviously do. The investment is solid, Trent continued. We just need a co-signer on the commercial mortgage, someone with established credit and business credentials. His smile landed on me like a spotlight. Someone like you, Miranda. I pulled my notepad closer and uncapped my pen the same way I did before any client consultation. My CPA training had taught me that numbers tell stories, emotions try to hide, and I wanted to hear the story beneath Trent's presentation. What's the projected cash flow for the first year? I asked, my voice level and professional. Trent's smile flickered but held. We're estimating strong growth, especially with social media marketing. That's not a number, I said. What's the monthly operating expense, rent, utilities, inventory, insurance, payroll? He waved his hand in a gesture meant to convey that such details were premature. We're still finalizing those projections. What's your contingency reserve? 3 months, 6 months? Miranda, you're getting stuck in the weeds, he said, and his charm was developing an edge, now irritation showing through the polish. This is about vision, about family, supporting family. I turned to Kayla, who'd been silent through Trent's entire presentation. Have you done a market analysis? What's the competitive landscape for boutiques in the area? What's your unique value proposition? Kayla's face pinched into the expression I'd seen since she was 8 years old, the one that meant she was about to make everyone else responsible for her disappointment. See, this is exactly what I knew you'd do. You always need to control everything. You can't just be happy for me. You can't just support your own sister without turning it into some kind of interrogation. Mom and Dad sat at the far end of the table, heavy as bookends, saying nothing but radiating expectation. They didn't have to speak. Their presence was the message. They were here as witnesses to my expected compliance, as the weight that would tip the scales toward yes. Dad's arms were crossed, his jaw set, in that way that meant he'd already decided what the right answer was. Mom looked down at her hands folded in her lap, the same way she'd looked down through 1,000 small injustices in our family history. I saw the trap's architecture clearly now. No numbers, no projections, no actual business plan, just emotions, just family obligation, just the assumption that I'd yield the way I always had. They'd grown so comfortable with my pattern of reluctant agreement, followed by silent resentment, that they'd stopped preparing real answers. They expected the same old Miranda, the one who swallowed her concerns and signed whatever was put in front of her, because keeping peace was easier than standing firm. But the meeting notes I was taking weren't just notes. They were documentation. Every deflection, every non-answer, every emotional manipulation was going into my record. The small digital recorder in my cardigan pocket was capturing every word legal in Illinois insurance against memories that would inevitably become selective. The smile I wore, wasn't surrender. It was armor I'd learned to polish until it reflected back whatever people wanted to see while hiding everything I actually felt. For the first time in my adult life, I said the word I'd been trained since childhood never to say. No. The single syllable landed like a stone in still water. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kayla's expression shifted from pouting disappointment to something darker storm clouds gathering in her eyes. Trent's practiced smile cracked at the corners, and underneath it, I glimpsed something calculating and cold, the real face beneath the real estate agent charm. Dad shifted in his chair, uncrossing his arms, and then crossing them again, uncomfortable with a script that wasn't following the expected lines. Mom's gaze stayed fixed on her hands. I stood, excused myself with perfect politeness, and walked to my kitchen to make tea. My hands were steady as I filled the kettle. Steady as they were when I balanced accounts that were off by pennies, steady because I'd learned long ago that showing emotion was the same as showing weakness in a family that mistook silence for strength. The water heated. I poured it over an Earl Grey tea bag and watched the color bleed into the clear water, transforming it into something else entirely. When I returned to the dining room, I set my teacup down with care and met their eyes one by one. When the numbers add up, I'll consider it. Until then, my answer is no. The meeting ended with tight smiles and promises to revisit the conversation later to give me time to think about it, to remember what family means. They gathered their materials and left, and I stood in my doorway watching their car pull away into the August dusk. But I knew something they didn't know yet. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing to take what I wouldn't give. Between August and Thanksgiving, something shifted in the family atmosphere like a front moving in before a storm. Phone calls became less frequent. Text messages in the family group chat continued without me, conversations I'd see only in fragments when someone accidentally replied to the whole thread. I felt the distance growing, but told myself it was natural, seasonal, nothing to worry about. I was wrong. They weren't pulling away randomly, they were organizing. Thanksgiving dinner started the way poison always starts, with something that looks like food. We gathered at Mom and Dad's house the way we had for decades, the turkey golden in its roasting pan, the table set with the dishes that had served 3 generations. I'd brought rolls homemade from Grandma May's recipe, still warm in the basket I'd wrapped in kitchen towels. For the first hour, everything seemed normal, but normal was just the seasoning hiding the rot underneath. Mom opened the campaign during the blessing, her voice soft and concerned in that way that makes cruelty sound like caring. We're grateful to have family together, even when some of us have been distant lately. Her eyes didn't look at me directly, but everyone at the table knew who she meant. We pray that those who've lost their way back to family values might find their path again. The blessing ended and conversations resumed, but the seed had been planted. Uncle Jim, who I'd lent $3,000 to in 2019 for his truck repair and never been repaid, picked it up next. Some people just get too successful, you know. Forget where they came from. Get corporate. He said corporate like it was a disease, like my years of education and building a business were somehow a betrayal of my roots. My cousin Derek, who'd stayed rent-free in my apartment for 2 months while getting back on his feet, nodded along. She's always been wound pretty tight. Control issues, probably. He said it casually, like diagnosing a stranger, not someone who'd given him a key and asked for nothing in return. Aunt Susan, who'd never once offered to help during Mom's surgeries, who'd been conspicuously absent during every family crisis that required actual work, chimed in with, "She does need to loosen up, learn to go with the flow more." I watched the pattern emerge like numbers arranging themselves into an equation I hadn't wanted to solve. Each criticism was small, almost gentle, but they accumulated like compound interest. My distance became evidence of my coldness. My questions about Kayla's business plan became proof of my controlling nature. My professional success became a character flaw, something that separated me from real family values. The narrative was flipping in real time. I wasn't the one who'd held things together through crisis after crisis. I was the one creating tension by refusing to be flexible, by asking for accountability, by saying no. The relatives who spoke had never paid their own way through anything. They were the ones who'd needed bailing out, needed loans that became gifts, needed someone to organize and manage and fix. Now they sat in judgment like a Greek chorus performing agreement with lines that had clearly been rehearsed. The complaints were too similar, too coordinated. Someone had workshopped this, refined the talking points, distributed the script. Only Aunt Ruth remained quiet. She sat at the far end of the table, Dad's older sister, the one who'd always seemed to see things other people missed. Her eyes met mine across the turkey and stuffing, and something passed between us, not pity, but recognition. Like she was trying to transmit a message through silence, an invisible safety line thrown across the wreckage of a family dinner that had become something else entirely. Then Kayla stood. Not the casual rising to refill a glass or reach for more gravy, but a formal stand, deliberate and rehearsed. She cleared her throat and waited for silence, waited for all eyes to turn to her. Trent sat beside her with his hand resting on the table, positioned like a stage manager ready to step in if his actor forgot her lines. "I think we need to address something as a family," Kayla said, her voice carrying that particular quality of someone who'd practiced this speech, who'd stood in front of mirrors perfecting the tone of regretful necessity. "Miranda's behavior has been affecting all of us. The negativity, the refusal to support family dreams, the judgment." She paused for effect. "So we talked, and we think it's time for a vote." Her hand rose, first palm out, fingers together like taking an oath. "All in favor of Miranda no longer being welcome at family gatherings until she changes her attitude and learns to be part of this family again." The hands went up in sequence, choreographed whether they knew it or not. Derek's shot up immediately, eager. Uncle Jim's followed slower but certain. Aunt Susan glanced at Kayla, first seeking approval, then raised hers tentatively. Cousin Rachel, who I barely knew, raised hers after looking around the table to see which way the wind was blowing. Two more hands, distant relatives whose names I struggled to remember, people who appeared at holiday dinners but never at funerals or hospital visits. 7 hands total out of 12 people present. Some of them hesitated before raising their hands, looking sideways at each other, checking to make sure they weren't breaking ranks. They preferred the safety of groupthink to the danger of individual conscience. Being part of the mob felt safer than standing alone, even if standing alone meant standing for truth. Dad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his face carefully, neutral. He didn't raise his hand, but he didn't lower it either, because it was never up. He just leaned back and refused to look at me, refused to meet my eyes, his abstention somehow cutting deeper than the raised hands. At least the raised hands took a position. Dad's silence was cowardice dressed as neutrality. Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, playing the role of the mother torn between children, but she didn't vote no. She didn't stand up and say this was wrong. She just dabbed her eyes and let it happen. Let them vote on my existence in the family, like I was a budget item that could be cut to balance their emotional books. Kayla's face held something I recognized from childhood, that particular expression when she got exactly what she wanted, triumph trying to disguise itself as reluctant concern. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said, and she wasn't sorry at all. "But we have to protect our family dynamic." The room had completed its transformation from dining room to kangaroo court. There was a jury, a verdict, a sentence. The only thing missing was a defense, but I hadn't been offered one. This wasn't a trial, it was a predetermined outcome with theatrical presentation. I didn't beg, didn't cry or argue or ask what I'd done to deserve this. I simply looked at each face one by one, cataloging them like a photographer documenting a crime scene. Who raised their hands? Who looked away? Who stayed silent? I was taking inventory of loyalties, mapping the battlefield, understanding exactly who stood where, when it mattered. I set down my fork with care, the silver resting perfectly parallel to the edge of my plate. I dabbed my mouth with the cloth napkin, not paper, because I'd brought the good linens, the ones I'd laundered and ironed that morning. Small acts of care that went unnoticed as always. I smiled, thin and precise, a smile that could peel truth from lies like a paring knife removing skin from an apple sharp enough to cut clean, but leaving no visible blood. The dinner continued around me. People passed dishes, made small talk, performed normalcy. But the turkey tasted like cardboard in my mouth. The air felt thick with performance, everyone playing their assigned roles in a script I hadn't been given. My smile stayed in place, controlled and measuring, while my mind worked 3 steps ahead. They thought my silence meant surrender. They thought they'd won. Their biggest mistake was confusing quiet with defeat. That vote and that precise moment activated something they never knew existed. The folder Kayla tore open contained 5 years of financial autopsy, every organ laid out for examination, every cause of death, documented with the precision my profession had trained me for. The first page was a summary spreadsheet color-coded and cross-referenced each row, a line item of my invisible labor translated into dollars and cents that couldn't be argued with or reinterpreted through the lens of selective memory. Hospital bills from Mom's ongoing complications, $87,234.19. Not a round number, not an estimate, but exact to the penny, because I'd paid every invoice as it arrived, transferred funds from my business account to the hospital's billing department, kept copies of every confirmation. The spreadsheet listed each payment by date, check number, and corresponding medical procedure. March 2019, post-surgical follow-up, $1,200. August 2020, emergency room visit, $4,300. January 2022, specialist consultation and imaging, $6,800. The numbers marched down the page in neat columns, undeniable as mathematics. Home repairs for Dad, $12,400. New air conditioning unit in July 2021, when his old one died during a heat wave. Roof repairs after the ice storm of 2020. Plumbing work when the basement flooded. Every receipt saved, every contractor's invoice, photocopied, every canceled check preserved. I'd even noted the conversations where Dad had said he'd pay me back when his disability check came through, promises that evaporated like morning dew. Kayla's credit cards cleared 3 separate times, $23,890 total. First bailout in 2018 when she was 26 and couldn't understand why spending more than you earned was a problem. Second in 2020, during what she called her discovery phase of bouncing between jobs and cities. Third in 2022, 6 months before she met Trent, when she'd cried on my couch and sworn this time was different, this time she'd learned. Each bailout was documented with the credit card statements showing the balances, the payment confirmations, her text messages saying, "Thank you so much, I'll pay you back, I promise." Property tax bailouts. When Dad fell behind $8,500 spread across 2 years. I'd paid directly to the county to keep them from putting a lien on the house where we'd grown up, the house that meant everything to Mom. The spreadsheet was color-coded with a legend at the top. Green meant fully documented with multiple forms of evidence receipts. Bank records written, acknowledgement of debt. Yellow meant partial documentation, usually just bank records and verbal confirmation. Red meant promises made but no documentation. There was no red on my spreadsheet. I'd learned my lesson about trust. Every check had been photographed before I mailed it. Every text message confirming receipt had been saved. Every email discussion about repayment had been archived in a dedicated folder on my computer, backed up to cloud storage, backed up again to an external drive. The numbers were built of steel. They couldn't lie, couldn't flatter themselves, couldn't be gaslit into different shapes by people who wanted to remember things differently than they'd happened. Each line item corresponded to a specific date, a specific conversation, a specific promise that tomorrow would be different. Kayla's hands shook as she turned to the second section, and the color that had drained from her face wasn't coming back. This section contained the evidence that transformed family dysfunction into criminal conspiracy. A draft contract for the sale of Grandma May's land, 20 acres of prairie and oak trees on the edge of town, where we'd spent childhood summers catching fireflies and climbing trees and believing the world was good. The contract showed the land being sold to Harmon Development Corporation for $400,000. But Trent's name appeared in the appendix as consulting partner with a separate compensation agreement for 15% of all profits. The boutique maze place wasn't the dream, it was the cover story, the emotional manipulation designed to get me to co-sign so they'd have capital to move forward, to get access to family financial documents, to position themselves as stakeholders in decisions about Grandma's estate. Email printouts followed messages I'd obtained through methods I'd rather not specify, but which were completely legal, given that they'd been sent from accounts that touched family business I had legitimate access to. Subject lines that made my stomach turn: remove M. Shaw from approval chain. Accelerated timeline family leverage points. Boutique front emotional angle working. Titan. A confidential assessment from Harmon Development showed the land's real value at $680,000, undervalued by 40% in the contract Trent had drafted. The real profit margin was hidden in appendices and fine print. The kind of details that people who don't read contracts carefully never notice. Trent wasn't just Kayla's fiancé. He was the inside man for a land grab that would have stripped our family of Grandma's legacy and enriched him and his partners by hundreds of thousands of dollars. The boutique was the Trojan horse, and I'd almost let them wheel it through the gates. The final section contained something that made even me angry when I'd discovered it, and I'd thought I was beyond anger. A power of attorney document that had been modified, someone attempting to alter the signing authority to give Kayla access to certain family accounts and estate decisions. The forgery was amateur work font inconsistencies where new text had been inserted, dates that had been manually changed with the month and day in slightly different typefaces. A scanned version of my signature that showed pixel artifacts when you zoomed in. The kind of mistakes that happen when someone thinks they're clever with Photoshop but doesn't understand that forensic document examination has been dealing with digital forgeries for 20 years. Kayla's jaw trembled as she read that page. Her eyes darted to Trent, looking for rescue, looking for explanation, looking for him to make this make sense. Trent arranged his face into an expression of confusion, his mouth slightly open, his eyebrows raised, but his neck betrayed him. The pulse point below his jaw was hammering visibly, the kind of physiological response you can't fake the body's admission of guilt when the mouth tries to lie. Aunt Ruth leaned forward slightly in her chair, her eyes steady on the unfolding scene. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone watching a play they'd already read, knowing this moment was written in the script, inevitable as sunrise. Her phone was still in her hand, still recording, documenting this moment for purposes I would only understand later. The room held its collective breath, 12 people frozen in various postures of shock or calculation or dawning understanding. They waited for me to speak, to explain, to make a speech about betrayal and justice. I didn't. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table, my posture perfect, my face calm, and let the evidence speak in the only language that mattered. But the thing that made them go completely silent wasn't the paperwork. It was the voice that came from my phone. I reached for my phone, which I'd placed face down beside my plate before dinner began, and unlocked it with deliberate slowness. My movements were careful, measured, giving them time to understand that what was coming next would be worse than numbers on a spreadsheet. Numbers could be disputed, reframed, explained away by people skilled in emotional manipulation. But voices carried truth in a way that couldn't be edited by memory or softened by time. I pulled up the audio file dated May 17, 2024, 6 months before this Thanksgiving dinner, and turned the volume up loud enough for everyone at the table to hear clearly. The recording was completely legal. Illinois is a one-party consent state, which means I had every right to record any conversation I was part of, and I'd been recording important family discussions since 2016, when that college friend taught me what trust without documentation could cost. I'd learned to protect myself not from paranoia, but from experience, and that protection was about to justify itself in ways I'd never wanted. Mom's voice came through the phone speaker, small and trembling in a way that made my chest tight, even though I'd listened to this recording a dozen times while preparing tonight's folder. Miranda, honey, I need to talk to you about Kayla's business. There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone is reading from a script they're not comfortable with, and then she continued. I really think you should reconsider helping her. It would mean so much to the family. In the background, barely audible but unmistakable once you knew to listen for it, a male voice murmured instructions. I couldn't make out the exact words on this recording, but I had a longer version saved on my laptop where the prompting was clearer. Trent's voice feeding Mom her lines like a stage director hovering in the wings. Mom's voice continued cracking slightly. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. He said it would help Kayla get started and I just wanted to help. You know how I worry about her. The genuine affection in her words made everything worse, not better. This wasn't a villain manipulating for personal gain. This was my mother scared and confused and desperate to help one daughter being used as a weapon against the other. She'd been recruited into their scheme through her own love turned into an instrument of manipulation because Trent understood that the fastest way to my signature was through my mother's voice, asking for help. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, Mom's increasingly uncomfortable attempts to convince me to co-sign for the boutique loan, her voice getting smaller and more uncertain with each sentence, as she realized I wasn't responding the way she'd been told I would. Then the audio cut off. The room's emotional center collapsed like a building with its supports removed. Several people's eyes darted involuntarily toward Trent, then quickly away down to their plates, to their hands anywhere but at the man who'd just been exposed manipulating a woman with ongoing health issues and a history of trusting too easily. The feeling in the room was like cold wind coming through a window left barely open. Not a dramatic gust, but a steady chill that worked its way into your bones, making you understand that the temperature had changed permanently. My finger hovered over the phone's screen. The audio file was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long. I'd only played the first minute. The rest contained Mom breaking down her voice, dissolving into tears, saying, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I just want everyone to be happy. I don't understand why this is so hard. It contained her admitting that Trent had visited her 3 times to practice the call, that he'd told her exactly what words would work on me, that she felt like she was betraying me, but didn't know how to say no to helping Kayla. I made a choice in that moment, my finger touching the screen to stop the playback. I clicked the phone off and folded it closed, setting it down beside my water glass with the same care I'd used for everything else tonight. I chose to protect my mother from further humiliation, to spare her the public exposure of her complete breakdown on that phone call. She'd been used, manipulated, weaponized by someone who understood that mothers will do almost anything to keep peace between their children, even when keeping peace means enabling theft. I would keep that portion of the truth private, would let it stay between Mom and me, would allow her the dignity of not having every tear and moment of confusion played out in front of relatives who'd use it as gossip for years. The truth would find them anyway in silence, in sleepless nights, in the moments when they looked in mirrors and had to reconcile the people they'd been tonight with the people they wanted to believe they were. I'll let the law and time say the rest. I said, my voice surgical in its precision, cutting away only what needed to be removed and leaving everything else intact. No threats about litigation, no yelling, no dramatic declarations. I simply stated a fact: this was now a legal matter. And legal matters proceed on their own timeline, independent of emotion or family pressure or attempts at reconciliation that weren't backed by actual change. I understood something they were still learning. What I held was ledgers and evidence documentation and timestamps, the kind of proof that courtrooms respect. What they held was emotional chaos, anger and fear and desperation, and the sudden understanding that actions have consequences. But chaos comes and goes like summer storms, loud and dramatic, but temporary. Numbers remain standing like mile markers on a highway, permanent fixtures that don't move just because you're upset about where they're positioned. I wouldn't burn my mother at this table. I wouldn't play the rest of that recording, wouldn't expose every vulnerable moment she'd had on that phone call, wouldn't turn her into entertainment for relatives who'd failed to support her during every actual crisis she'd faced. But I also wouldn't let Trent hide behind her, wouldn't let him use her confusion and love as a shield against accountability. The boundary was clear: justice would proceed through proper channels, but cruelty wouldn't be my weapon. I could pursue what was right without becoming what was wrong. Dad's hand shook as he reached for his water glass, lifting it to his mouth and then setting it down without drinking the water, sloshing slightly against the sides. His face had gone gray, the color of old newspaper, and for the first time since this dinner began, he looked directly at me. What he saw in my expression, I don't know, but whatever it was made him look away quickly, back down to his plate where his turkey sat untouched and cooling. Kayla's eyes were wild, darting between the folder, the phone, Trent's face, calculating her next move, like someone trying to find an exit in a burning building. Her breathing had gone shallow and rapid, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested panic barely controlled. The folder remained open on the table, its contents spread across the white linen like evidence marked and tagged at a crime scene. Papers overlapping numbers, visible, the truth laid out in a way that couldn't be gathered back up and hidden. Pandora's box after the lid has been removed, everything that had been contained now released, impossible to stuff back inside and pretend it had never escaped. What I didn't know yet, sitting there in my calm certainty that I'd won, that justice would prevail, was that they were willing to do something far worse than I'd imagined. The retaliation started before I'd even driven home from that Thanksgiving dinner. My phone buzzed with a notification that I'd been removed from the Shaw family group chat, the one that had been active since 2019, with 35 members spanning 3 generations. 5 years of birthday reminders, holiday planning, shared photos of grandchildren, and garden harvests gone in a single administrative click. I watched the notification disappear from my screen and felt nothing which surprised me. I'd expected hurt. Instead, I felt relieved, like a subscription to something I'd never wanted had finally been canceled. The exile became official in increments over the next 48 hours, each severance arriving with the bureaucratic efficiency of an organization shutting down a failing branch. Sunday morning, I attended church service the way I had for 6 consecutive years, sitting in my usual pew 3 rows from the front. Afterward, I walked past the donor recognition board in the fellowship hall, the wooden plaque where names were engraved under giving categories. My name had always appeared under benefactors $5,000 and above, acknowledging the heating assistance fund I'd contributed to every winter. The plaque had been updated. My name was gone, the space where it had been filled with someone else's contribution, as if my 6 years of giving had been erased from the church's institutional memory. Pastor Mike avoided eye contact when I passed him in the hallway. Mrs. Henderson, who'd always stopped to chat about her grandchildren, suddenly became very interested in the bulletin board announcements. I left through the side door and drove home in silence, the car's heater blowing warm air that couldn't quite reach the cold spot forming in my chest. The business consequences arrived via text message, those apologetic notes that managers send when they're following orders they don't quite agree with but won't resist. Miranda, I need to pause our collaboration for now due to the family situation. I hope you understand. The message came from Robert Chen, who I'd been consulting for on a quarterly basis for 3 years, helping his small manufacturing company organize their books and plan for tax season. No details about what family situation he'd heard about, no questions about my side of the story. Just a polite corporate withdrawal, clinical as a form letter. 2 more messages arrived that afternoon, with similar wording, similar vagueness, similar conclusions. The messages felt cold as past due invoices, transactional and final. I made my morning coffee the next day and stood at my kitchen window watching the season's first snowfall in fat, lazy flakes that accumulated on the brown grass. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of November silence that comes before winter truly arrives. I wondered if peace also chooses where to land the way snow does, selective about which surfaces it graces and which it passes over. Some ground receives the blessing of covering, other ground stays bare and exposed. Kayla's social media became a carefully curated narrative of victimhood and resilience. The posts appeared on Instagram and Facebook within days of Thanksgiving, each one precisely calculated to hit emotional notes without providing actual information. Sometimes you have to say goodbye to toxic energy even when it wears a familiar face, choosing peace over control, protecting my dreams and my future family. The post included a photo of Kayla mom and dad standing together in mom and dad's living room, all three smiling, looking united and whole, as if they'd closed ranks around an empty space and discovered they were stronger without it. The photo had been taken at an angle that made it clear someone was missing from the family portrait, a deliberate absence that viewers would notice and ask about. The posts gained traction the way vague accusations always do. People who loved narratives more than truth clicked the little heart icon and left comments like, "You deserve happiness," and "Proud of you for setting boundaries." And family isn't always blood. They were supporting a story they'd invented to fill in the blanks. Kayla had left a story where she was the hero and I was the villain, and nobody bothered to ask for evidence because the performance was satisfying enough. One of my smaller consulting contracts was terminated the following week. The client, a boutique marketing firm I'd been working with for 18 months, sent an email that referenced reputational concerns, without specifying what those concerns were or where they'd originated. I didn't ask. I knew. Whisper campaigns don't require truth, only repetition and the appearance of consensus. I documented each instance the way my training had taught me a new spreadsheet with columns for date, platform, screenshot, impact. Every post Kayla made got archived. Every business loss got recorded. Every social slight got noted with the time and location. Another set of entries in the evidence file, another line of ink drying into permanence. I didn't respond, publicly, didn't craft my own social media defense, didn't try to tell my side of the story in Instagram captions or Facebook posts. In accounting, you don't argue with ledger entries. You simply record them accurately and let the numbers tell their own story when the audit comes. On the 5th day after Thanksgiving, a knock came at my front door. I opened it to find Aunt Ruth standing on my porch holding a box I recognized immediately. Grandma May's old tin box, the one that had sat on her bedroom dresser for as long as I could remember. The exterior was scratched from decades of handling the painted floral pattern worn at the corners where hands had gripped it most often. But the way Ruth held it careful and reverent suggested the contents had substance beyond sentiment. "When people burn ledgers," Ruth said, stepping inside without waiting for invitation, "they forget that some records aren't made of paper." Her voice carried an authority I'd heard only a few times before, the tone of someone who'd watched this particular play perform itself across generations and knew exactly how each act would unfold. I took the box from her hands and felt its weight heavier than its size suggested, and carried it to my oak dining table. The same table where I'd hosted family meals, where I'd worked late nights on client accounts, where I'd prepared the burgundy folder that had detonated at Thanksgiving dinner. I set the box down carefully and listened to the wall clock on my living room wall tick its steady rhythm, each second a quiet ally whispering that truth has patience, that time moves in favor of those who can wait. Ruth stayed for tea. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our cups, and she said nothing more about the box, or its contents, or why she'd brought it now. But her presence was its own statement. You are not alone. Sometimes the smallest gestures form the strongest structural supports, more reliable than grand promises or dramatic declarations. A cup of tea shared. A box delivered. A silence that says I see you when everyone else has looked away. Inside that box wasn't just memorabilia. It was power. After Ruth left, I sat alone at my dining table with the tin box between my hands, feeling its weight and history before opening it. The metal was cool to the touch. The painted flowers on its lid faded to soft pastels from decades of light and handling. I'd seen this box on Grandma May's dresser every time I'd visited her house, sitting among her jewelry and reading glasses, and the small porcelain figures she'd collected. I'd never thought to ask what was inside because some things feel too private to question too much, like intruding on the quiet spaces where a person keeps their most important thoughts. I lifted the lid carefully, the hinges creaking slightly with age. Inside, on top of everything else, lay a handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored stationery, the kind with a subtle texture that told you it had been chosen deliberately purchased for its quality and permanence. The fountain pen ink was still bold and dark despite the years Grandma's handwriting immediately recognizable with its careful loops and firm downstrokes. The date at the top read March 15, 2020, 3 years before she died in May 2023. To the grandchild who carries the most while receiving the least recognition. The letter began, and I had to stop reading for a moment because my vision blurred with tears. I hadn't given myself permission to cry since Thanksgiving. I blinked them away and continued. If you're reading this, Miranda, it means the patterns I've watched for years have finally reached their breaking point. I've seen how you hold this family together. I've seen how they take without thanking, how they lean, without supporting, how they assume your strength means you don't need care. I've seen it because I lived it once myself in different circumstances, but with the same weight. The letter continued for 2 full pages, Grandma's voice coming through as clearly as if she were sitting across from me at this table. She wrote about establishing a discretionary trust, specifically for the one who holds the family together when everyone else pulls apart. She wrote about watching family dynamics shift over the years, seeing entitlement grow where gratitude should have been, seeing my contributions become invisible through repetition. She wrote about wanting to protect me in ways she wished someone had protected her decades earlier. The tone was firm but warm legal strategy, written in the language of grandmother's love instructions, left behind by someone who understood that justice sometimes needs structure to survive sentiment. Beneath the letter lay a small brass key tarnished slightly with age but solid and real. It caught the light from my dining room fixture, reflecting back a promise I was only beginning to understand. There was also an old photograph. The colors slightly faded, showing Grandma standing in her garden with one hand on her hip and her eyes smiling with that particular expression. She'd had the look of someone who knew more than she said, who saw patterns others missed, who left instructions because she understood that knowledge is worthless if it dies with you. Aunt Ruth had remained quiet while I read, sipping her tea and giving me space to absorb what Grandma had written. When I finally looked up, Ruth set her cup down and began to explain with the precision of someone who'd been waiting years to have this conversation. Your grandmother worked with an estate attorney in 2020, Ruth said. Not the family lawyer who handled the basic will, but a specialist in estate planning and trust law. She spent months getting the structure exactly right. Ruth pulled a folder from her bag, legal documents that mirrored and expanded on what Grandma's letter had introduced. You're specifically named as the steady hand, the person who provided over 60% of financial and caregiving support to family members for 5 consecutive years. That's not an estimate, it's a provable threshold, and your documentation from Thanksgiving proves it easily. I thought about the spreadsheets in my burgundy folder, the bank statements and receipts and canceled checks. Grandma had known I'd have evidence because she'd known that I documented everything, knew that my CPA training meant I kept records the way other people kept journals. The trust contains something we call Clause 7. Ruth continued, sliding a specific page across the table toward me. The character protection provision. It states that if any family member publicly humiliates, excludes, or commits fraud against the primary caregiver, that's you, then I, as trustee, have the authority to temporarily transfer asset management to that person for a period of 3 years. During those 3 years, you'd manage Grandma's estate, including the land, the remaining investments, everything. But it comes with a requirement: 25% of any income generated must go to transparent community funds. Justice paired with responsibility. Protection paired with obligation. My mind raced through the implications. The land, Grandma's 20 acres where we'd spent childhood summers. The investments she'd carefully grown over decades. The legacy she'd built through Depression-era frugality and fierce independence. All of it could shift management if the conditions were met. The Thanksgiving vote triggered the clause, Ruth said quietly. The provision requires 2 things. First, documented proof that you provided more than 60% of support, which your spreadsheets establish beyond question. Second, Public humiliation witnessed by at least 5 people or documented in a public forum. I recorded the entire vote on my phone. 12 witnesses, 7 hands raised, a clear vote to exclude you from family gatherings. That constitutes public humiliation under the trust's definitions. She let that settle for a moment before continuing. I've already notified the estate attorney. We have a 30-day window to activate the clause, and we're well within it. The documentation is solid. The legal basis is unquestionable. I held the small brass key in my palm, feeling its weight, understanding that it represented access to something far larger than a locked box. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding of what power feels like when it's real and structured and backed by legal authority. Power is a heavy coat, but I'd been carrying weight for decades. This was just a different kind, a different shape that would sit on my shoulders in new ways. Ruth reached across the table and placed a business card on top of the open trust documents. The card was simple cream-colored with black text, Delia Grant Estate and Civil Litigation Attorney. Below the name was an address downtown and a phone number. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Ruth said. I've already made the appointment. She's expecting us. I picked up the card, feeling its thickness between my fingers, the quality of the cardstock telling me this was an attorney who understood that details matter, that presentation reflects substance. Tomorrow I would walk into an office and begin the process of shifting control of my grandmother's legacy from people who'd voted me out of their family to the person Grandma had chosen years ago when she saw patterns they thought were invisible. Tomorrow the ledger would change hands. Delia Grant's office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored building downtown, the kind of place where the elevator still had brass fixtures and the hallways smelled of wood polish and decades of serious conversations. Ruth and I arrived at 8:55 the next morning, early enough to show respect for time, but not so early as to seem desperate. The receptionist led us to a corner office with tall windows overlooking the street, and Delia stood to greet us with a handshake that was firm without being performative. She was mid-50s with a steel gray bob cut precisely at her jawline and eyes that assessed without judging. Her voice wasted no syllables, each word chosen for efficiency and impact. The office smelled of leather and old books, law volumes lining built-in shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. This was a space where serious matters were handled seriously, where the weight of legal consequence hung in the air like the scent of the leather furniture. "Document don't detonate," Delia said, after Ruth had explained the situation, and I'd provided copies of everything from the burgundy folder. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began taking notes in handwriting so precise it looked like typeface. "That's our philosophy here. We build cases that can't be dismantled, and we do it quietly until we're ready to move." She looked up at me with those assessing eyes. "Your documentation is excellent. Most clients come to me with emotions and assumptions. You've brought me a prosecutable case." She outlined the roadmap with the systematic clarity of someone who'd walked this path many times before. First, demand letters to Kayla and Trent for repayment of the documented debts, giving them 30 days to respond with a payment plan or face civil litigation. Second, cease and desist warnings regarding the social media defamation campaign, putting them on notice that further false statements would result in legal action. Third, preparation of subpoenas for financial records related to Grandma May's estate and any transactions involving Trent's development connections. Each step built on the previous one, creating a structure of accountability that couldn't be easily escaped. I nodded as she spoke, understanding the rhythm she was describing. The law moves like a ledger. I realized slow but certain few words, but heavy meaning. Every entry matters. Every line builds toward a total that eventually must be reconciled. There's no rushing it, but there's also no avoiding it once the process begins. "We're not destroying them," Delia emphasized, setting down her pen and meeting my eyes directly. "We're drawing boundaries with legal ink. Those boundaries will have consequences if they're crossed, but the goal is behavior change, not annihilation." She paused to let that distinction land. "This isn't revenge, it's accountability structured through the court system." The difference mattered more than I'd realized. I didn't want to become the villain in my own story. didn't want to turn into someone who wielded power cruelly just because I finally had access to it. I wanted justice, but justice that could look itself in the mirror afterward. Within 3 days, working with speed that surprised me, Delia had prepared and filed the formal demand letter to Kayla and Trent. The document was 8 pages long, itemizing every dollar I'd paid on their behalf over 5 years with corresponding dates, check numbers, and purposes. The total $131,524.19 appeared in bold text on page 1 and again on page 8, impossible to miss or minimize. The letter included payment deadlines structured in quarterly installments over 5 years, with interest calculations per Illinois law clearly explained. It was professional, unemotional, and absolutely devastating in its specificity. Simultaneously, I prepared a separate package for the Church Finance Committee. This one marked confidential and delivered by hand to Pastor Mike, with a request that it be reviewed in closed session. The package detailed discrepancies I'd noticed in the heating fund donations, the community assistance program where Trent had volunteered as coordinator for the past 2 years. No accusations, no inflammatory language, just numbers laid out in spreadsheets, dates of donations. I'd made copies of my canceled checks, and the amounts that had been reported to the congregation versus the amounts actually deposited. The math didn't match. Someone had been skimming, and the pattern of discrepancies aligned perfectly with the months Trent had been handling the donations. The elegance of justice, I was learning, lives entirely in its details. You don't need to shout or accuse or make dramatic presentations. You just need to show that 2 + 2 = 4 and let people draw their own conclusions when someone has been reporting it as 3. Delia reviewed every page of both documents before they were sent her red pen, marking tiny corrections and suggestions. "This is textbook," she said, finally signing off on the demand letter. "They'll have no credible defense. The question isn't whether they owe you, the question is whether they'll pay voluntarily or wait for a judge to order it." I felt no satisfaction when we dropped the demand letter in the mail, no sense of triumph or vindication. I felt only completion, the same feeling I got when a stubborn account finally reconciled after hours of searching for a misplaced decimal point. Everything was where it should be now. The numbers balanced. The truth was documented. What happened next would depend on their choices, not mine. The strategy Delia and I agreed on was containment, not destruction. My goal wasn't to take them down in some public spectacle, wasn't to humiliate them the way they'd humiliated me. I wanted to establish enforceable boundaries, lines they couldn't cross without facing real consequences. Not humiliation for its own sake, but responsibility for actions taken. "Do not argue on social media," Delia warned me as we finished our second meeting. "Do not engage with provocations, no matter how personal they get. Do not try to defend yourself in the court of public opinion. Let the paper trail speak. Let the legal process do its work." I took her advice seriously. That evening, I disabled notifications on my phone for all social media apps. I couldn't control what Kayla posted or what lies gained traction among people who preferred drama to documentation, but I could control my response, which was to have no response at all. Instead, I watered my houseplants, those small acts of normalcy that grounded me to routines that existed before this crisis and would continue after it. I made dinner just for myself and ate it slowly while reading a novel that had nothing to do with family or money or justice. I chose structured silence over useless noise. I understood now that in the courtroom of public opinion, everyone yells and the loudest voice wins temporarily. But in an actual courtroom, documents speak in whispers that judges hear more clearly than any amount of emotional performance. I would win where it mattered in law, not in social media theater. But what I didn't fully understand yet was that Trent had never played by rules, and he wasn't about to start now. The counterattack came 4 days after Delia mailed the demand letters, and it came through the channel I should have anticipated, but somehow hadn't the internet, where lies travel faster than truth and accusations don't require evidence to gain traction. A former client texted me a link with just 3 words. "Have you seen this?" I clicked through to a blog I'd never heard of, professionally designed with a clean layout that mimicked legitimate news sites. The header read, "Community Watch Investigating Local Financial Misconduct." The main article published that morning carried a headline designed for maximum damage: "Local CPA accused of elder financial abuse, Miranda Shaw under investigation for embezzlement." The article was carefully crafted using the passive voice and phrases like "sources say" and "allegations have emerged" to avoid direct accusations while implying guilt. It claimed I'd embezzled from senior citizens' heating assistance funds over multiple years, manipulating vulnerable elderly people who trusted me with their limited resources. It suggested I'd taken advantage of my dying grandmother's confusion to alter estate documents in my favor. The accompanying graphics were cheap stock photos of sad-looking elderly people and screenshots of what were supposedly bank records, but which I immediately recognized as fabricated. The fonts were wrong, the formatting didn't match actual bank statements, the account numbers had too many digits. The article was written in that fake journalistic tone that conspiracy theorists use, the voice of someone pretending to be an investigative reporter while actually just assembling lies into coherent-sounding paragraphs. Every sentence was designed for social media, sharing clickbait headlines embedded in clickbait paragraphs embedded in a clickbait article. It ended with a call for readers to share this story so others can protect their elderly family members from financial predators. My phone rang while I was still reading. Dad's name appeared on the screen. I answered, and his voice came through cold and distant, the voice he used when he'd already made up his mind and wasn't interested in discussion. "Miranda, I just read something online. You've embarrassed this entire family. How could you?" I tried to explain that the article was lies, that I had documentation proving everything, that this was obviously retaliation for the demand letters, but he'd already hung up. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like an insect, and I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone and understanding something that hurt more than the article itself. The pain wasn't that strangers on the internet believed lies about me. The pain was that my own father believed noise more easily than my documented truth. I'd spent decades proving myself through actions, building a reputation, one careful decision at a time, maintaining records that could withstand any audit. Yet a blog post crafted in a few hours by someone I'd never met carried more weight with my father than 36 years of being his daughter. The injustice of it tasted metallic in my mouth, like biting aluminum foil, sharp and wrong and lingering. I called Delia immediately, and she told me to forward her the link and do nothing else. "Don't respond, don't comment, don't try to defend yourself in that space," she said. "We handle this legally, not digitally." Then she said something that steadied me. "This kind of desperation usually means we're winning." I reached out to Marcus Chen, a former colleague who'd left public accounting to work in cybersecurity and digital forensics. He owed me a favor from years ago when I'd helped him navigate a complicated tax situation, and he paid it back within 6 hours. The blog domain was registered through a privacy service designed to hide ownership, but the hosting payments traced back to a business credit card. That card belonged to a small PR firm called Velocity Communications, operating out of a shared office space in the suburbs. Marcus dug deeper, following the money trail with the same precision I followed paper trails in accounting. Velocity Communications had received multiple payments over the past 3 months from a shell company registered in Delaware, one of those states where you can set up corporations with minimal disclosure. The payment amounts were small, deliberately kept under the thresholds that trigger automatic reporting. $800 here, $1,200 there, dispersed like light rain that doesn't seem significant until you realize it's been accumulating into flooding. The shell company's registered agent led to another layer of corporate structure, and that layer finally connected to a name, Reeves Development Group. I ran the name through every database I had access to. LinkedIn showed a CEO named Nathan Reeves, 40 years old, graduated from the same university I'd attended, though a few years ahead of me. Property records showed Reeves Development Group had been quietly acquiring land in our county, particularly parcels adjacent to the new highway extension that was scheduled for completion in 2 years. Business registrations showed Nathan Reeves as the principal owner with addresses and phone numbers that meant nothing to me until I cross-referenced them with old records I'd kept from college. Then my stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. Nathan Reeves. The name came back to me with the force of something I'd deliberately tried to forget. College spring semester 2008, my senior year. Nathan had been the charismatic business major everyone admired, the guy with big ideas and bigger charm, who convinced people that investing in his dreams was the smartest thing they could do. He'd pitched me on a startup that was going to revolutionize something I can't even remember. Now the details evaporate from these schemes, leaving only the financial wreckage behind. I'd co-signed a personal loan for $15,000 because he'd promised it was a sure thing, because we were friends, because I was young enough to believe that trust without documentation was noble rather than stupid. He'd made 2 payments, then vanished, changed his phone number, deleted his social media profiles, moved out of state without forwarding address. I'd spent the next 2 years paying off that loan alone, making monthly payments that cut into my starting salary at my first job, never telling my family because I was ashamed of being fooled. I thought I'd buried that mistake under years of better decisions and harder-won wisdom. But apparently, the mistake had never been buried, just dormant, waiting 16 years to resurface with interest. The picture clarified with the awful sharpness of a photograph developing in chemical solution, the image emerging line by line until the full scene becomes undeniable. The Thanksgiving vote wasn't organic family dysfunction. It was the opening move in a land acquisition strategy that had been planned for months, maybe years. Kayla was the sympathetic face, the sister with dreams that a mean older sibling was crushing. Trent was the inside operator, the charming fiancé who'd gotten close enough to learn family dynamics and estate structures. And Nathan Reeves was the money behind the curtain, the patient architect who'd identified Grandma May's 20 acres as a target and had orchestrated everything that followed. The land sat on a development corridor that would be worth millions once the highway extension opened. Nathan had been buying adjacent parcels, quietly assembling the pieces of a larger development project. But he needed our land to complete it, and we weren't selling. So he'd found another way in. The boutique was never real. It was a prop in a long con, something to make Kayla feel special, while actually serving as the vehicle for Trent to integrate himself into our family structure. Marcus found the timeline in email metadata and meeting records that Velocity Communications hadn't scrubbed carefully enough. Trent had met Nathan in June 2023. They'd had lunch 3 times before Trent coincidentally encountered Kayla at a community fundraiser in August 2023, striking up a conversation about local business opportunities that led to coffee, that led to dating, that led to engagement. Every step had been choreographed, every intimacy calculated, every family dinner a reconnaissance mission. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, and opened them. The story had outgrown my kitchen table and Thanksgiving dinner, and even Delia's carefully structured legal strategy. This was bigger than sibling rivalry or family dysfunction. This was calculated, patient, multi-year fraud orchestrated by someone I'd trusted 16 years ago and who apparently held grudges longer than most people hold mortgages. I didn't call Dad back to explain. I didn't post on social media defending myself. I didn't threaten to sue or make dramatic declarations. I sent an invoice. The invoice Delia prepared wasn't a piece of correspondence, it was a surgical instrument. She drafted it that same afternoon after I'd forwarded her Marcus's findings about Nathan Reeves and the connection to Velocity Communications. The document was addressed to the LLC that owned the blog, with copies sent to the PR firm, the hosting company, and the registered agent of the shell corporation that had funded the whole operation. The language was scalpel sharp, each sentence cutting away any ambiguity about what would happen next. Your client published knowingly false statements constituting per se defamation under Illinois law, the letter began. The article, titled Local CPA Accused of Elder Financial Abuse, contains specific, provably false claims that have damaged Ms. Shaw's professional reputation and caused measurable financial harm. Illinois statute provides for both compensatory and punitive damages in cases of malicious defamation. Failure to comply with the following demands within 72 hours will result in litigation seeking damages exceeding $500,000. The demands were simple, immediate retraction of the article removal from all platforms, a public apology with specific language Delia had drafted, and reimbursement for legal fees already incurred. The tone was professional ice, no heat, no anger, no emotional language that could be dismissed as hysterical overreaction. Just consequences spelled out in billable hours and court filing fees, each paragraph citing specific statutes and case precedents. Delia noted in the letter that her firm maintained a 94% success rate in defamation litigation, a detail that wasn't bragging, but rather a factual statement of probability that anyone considering their options would need to weigh. The blog host received a separate letter outlining their liability for maintaining defamatory content after being notified of its false nature. Delia knew exactly which pressure points to apply, which legal obligations hosting companies have that most people never think about until an attorney explains them in language that makes non-compliance expensive. Within 48 hours, the blog post vanished. I checked the link Marcus had originally sent me, and it returned a 404 error page not found. No apology appeared, no public acknowledgement that they'd published lies, but the silence was its own form of admission. People don't remove content they believe is true. They remove it when lawyers make staying silent cheaper than fighting. While Delia was dismantling the PR attack, I was preparing a different kind of documentation. I'd been thinking about the Church Finance Committee and the Heating Assistance Fund ever since I'd seen Trent's name in the boutique contract as a consultant. Men who steal in one context rarely limit themselves to a single victim. I spent 2 evenings going through my records, pulling every donation I'd made to the church's heating fund over the past 6 winters, cross-referencing the amounts against what had been reported to the congregation in the quarterly financial summaries that got printed in the bulletin. The discrepancies emerged like a connect-the-dots picture, obvious once you knew to look for the pattern. I'd donated $43,000 over 6 years, making contributions every November through March, when elderly church members needed help paying their heating bills. But the amounts reported to the congregation were consistently lower, sometimes by a few $100s, sometimes by over $1,000. The differences weren't random. They aligned perfectly with the months when Trent had been serving as volunteer community outreach coordinator, the role that gave him access to donation checks before they reached the official treasurer. I compiled everything into a binder 2 inches thick. Bank statements showing my donations, copies of my canceled checks with the church's endorsement stamp receipts the church had given me for tax purposes, and printouts of the quarterly financial reports from the bulletin. Every discrepancy was highlighted in yellow, the differences calculated and totaled on a summary sheet. The math was undeniable. Approximately $8,000 over 3 years had gone missing, skimmed off the top in amounts small enough that no single instance would trigger alarm, but large enough to accumulate into theft. I delivered the binder in person to Pastor Mike with a request that it be reviewed in closed session with the Finance Committee. I didn't make accusations. I didn't demand action. I just said, "I think there are some inconsistencies you should be aware of," and left the binder on his desk. The Finance Committee met 2 days later. I wasn't invited, which was appropriate. This was an internal matter, now not mine to control, but Mrs. Henderson, who served as committee secretary, told me afterward what had happened. The conference room had gone completely silent as they reviewed the documentation. The only sound the turning of pages and the occasional sharp intake of breath as someone recognized what they were looking at. The committee chair, a retired accountant named Frank Morrison, who'd spent 40 years auditing manufacturing companies, had looked physically ill as he calculated the totals. Trent was removed from his volunteer position that same afternoon. No ceremony, no public announcement, no explanation to the congregation. Just an updated website listing that no longer included his name in the community outreach section. The church operated like many institutions do when confronted with uncomfortable truths, quietly, efficiently, with minimal public acknowledgement. They couldn't undo the theft, but they could stop it from continuing. The community narrative began to shift after that, though not in the dramatic way stories suggest these things happen. There was no moment of public vindication, no town square apology, No social media post that went viral with the real truth. Instead, the reversal happened through quiet recalibration, through conversations in grocery store aisles and church parking lots where people said softly, almost embarrassed, maybe we were too quick to judge. People who'd believed the blog started asking questions about who'd written it and why it had disappeared so suddenly. People who'd nodded along when Kayla posted about toxic family members started noticing that the only specific accusations came from one direction, while the documentation came from another. Miranda's reputation rebuilt itself not through fanfare, but through attention slowly redirecting itself. The story in people's minds shifted from, "What did she do wrong?" to, "What has she actually been doing for us?" They remembered winters when the heating fund had kept their elderly parents warm. They remembered community events that had been quietly funded without anyone taking credit. They remembered a steady presence that showed up without seeking recognition. I met Delia for coffee one morning a week after the blog had vanished, and she smiled that particular half-smile lawyers give when a case is proceeding exactly as planned. "Now we activate the trust clause," she said, setting down her cup. "The groundwork is laid. The defamation attempt failed. The financial theft is documented. Your character is being rehabilitated without us having to say a word. It's time." The legal machinery was in motion now, no longer preparation, but execution. Not loud, not fast, but inexorable in the way that systems become when all the pieces align correctly. Like a glacier, Delia had once told me, slow-moving but unstoppable, once momentum builds, reshaping everything in its path through pressure applied consistently over time. I was stirring sugar into my coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Ruth. Just 7 words, but they changed the trajectory of everything we'd been building. "Found something. Come over immediately." I drove to Ruth's house, immediately the same house that had been Grandma May's for 50 years before Ruth inherited it after Grandma's death. The evening light was slanting through the lace curtains in the living room when Ruth opened the door, casting the same golden glow I remembered from childhood visits when Grandma would make us lemonade and let us play in the garden until fireflies came out. The house still smelled the same lavender sachets and old books, and something indefinable that was just Grandma's presence soaked into the walls over decades. Ruth didn't waste time with small talk. She led me to the dining room table where another box sat waiting, smaller than the tin box she'd brought to my house, older, its wood grain darkened with age and handling. She opened it without ceremony and pulled out a document I recognized immediately from its format, a quitclaim deed, the kind used to transfer property ownership. But this one was dated July 1998, 26 years ago, and it bore Ruth's signature attempting to sell a different parcel of Shaw family land, 15 acres on the south side of the county, that had belonged to Grandma's parents originally. "I trusted someone back then," Ruth said, her voice steady, but carrying edges of old pain that time had smoothed but not erased. "His name was David Cortland. He was 35, I was 32. He seemed perfect, charming in that effortless way that doesn't feel like effort, talked constantly about our future together, knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He was in real estate development, claimed he was building a career that would set us up for life." She sat down across from me, her hands resting on the table, in a way that reminded me suddenly of Grandma, that same gesture of steadiness before delivering difficult truths. He tried to sell land that wasn't his to sell. He'd gotten access to family documents when I wasn't paying attention, made copies during visits here when I thought he was just being interested in family history. The signature on this deed isn't mine. It's a forgery, amateur, but good enough that it might have passed if the buyer hadn't been required to get title insurance. I looked at the signature, seeing the subtle differences. Once Ruth pointed them out, the way the R leaned slightly wrong, the loop in the H, that was too large. "How did you catch it?" I asked. "I didn't," Ruth said. "Grandma did. She'd never liked David, said there was something about him that didn't sit right, the way he asked too many questions about land values and property taxes for someone who was supposedly just making conversation. When he asked me to come with him to visit his parents for a weekend, Grandma insisted on seeing all the family documents I'd shown him. She went through everything in this house, found papers out of order, found this deed attempt that had been filed with the county but not yet processed. She called the county clerk, called a lawyer, and had the whole thing stopped before it could complete. Ruth's eyes were distant now, seeing the past play out again in memory. The legal fees cost $6,000, which was real money in 1998. The family turmoil was worse. Dad was furious at me for being foolish. Mom cried for weeks. Everyone had opinions about how I should have known better. David disappeared the day the lawyer contacted him, changed his number, moved to another state. I never saw him again. She pulled another document from the box, this one handwritten on yellow legal paper in Grandma's distinctive script. In 2000, 2 years after all of it was resolved, Grandma sat me down at this table and said, "We're going to make sure this never happens again. Not to you, not to your nieces, not to anyone in this family who comes after us." That's when she first started talking about setting up a trust, about building in protections that would activate if someone tried this kind of manipulation again. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. She spent 20 years planning this. She spent 20 years watching. Ruth corrected, learning, anticipating. She saw the patterns in Kayla, the entitlement that grew from being the youngest and prettiest, the financial irresponsibility that Mom and Dad enabled by always bailing her out, the attraction to charismatic men who had vague careers and big promises. Grandma recognized it because she'd watched the same pattern with me, except I'd been old enough to be devastated when it fell apart. She worried about what would happen when Kayla found her version of David Cortland. Ruth pulled out the trust document, the one I'd already seen, but now she showed me the dates and the drafting history. Grandma started working with the estate attorney in 2018, 2 years before the final trust was established. She revised it 4 times, each time making the protections more specific, the triggering conditions more clear. By 2020, when she signed the final version, she wasn't being paranoid or controlling. She was being prepared based on precedent. The pieces were clicking into place like tumblers in a lock, each one falling into position until the mechanism could finally turn. "That's why you're the trustee," I said. "Not because you're the oldest, but because you've lived this." "Exactly," Ruth said. "I understand the cost of misplaced trust. I understand the value of documentation. I understand how good people can be manipulated by people who study manipulation the way others study music or mathematics. Grandma told me when she asked me to be trustee, you'll know what to look for because you've seen it before. And when it happens, not if, but when you'll have to be strong enough to activate the protections, even if it means going against family who don't understand yet." Ruth reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm. Grandma said something else I didn't fully understand until now. She said, when people burn the ledgers, they forget that some records aren't made of paper. They're made of memory and preparation. They're made of one generation learning and the next generation being ready. I held the 1998 contract in my other hand, feeling its weight, understanding that I was holding not just a piece of failed fraud from decades ago, but a blueprint that had been followed again with eerie precision. The past wasn't just prologue in my family, it was literally a script being performed again with different actors, different specific details, but the same fundamental structure. Charismatic outsider, romantic attachment, access to family documents, attempt to separate land from family forgery when cooperation couldn't be obtained. Grandma May had fought this battle in 1998 through reactive emergency measures. But she'd learned from it, prepared for it, built structures, so that when it happened again, because family patterns repeat like genetic traits passing through generations, her granddaughters wouldn't have to fight unarmed and unprepared. She'd turned her daughter's near disaster into her granddaughter's protection plan. I looked at Ruth and saw not just my aunt, but a survivor of the same war I was fighting, someone who'd walked this battlefield 26 years ago and come out understanding the terrain in ways that only experience teaches. "Now I understand," I said quietly. This wasn't just a family drama. This was a war Grandma had already taught us how to win. Understanding Ruth's history and Grandma's preparation gave me the clarity I needed for what came next. The trust clause Grandma had written wasn't arbitrary or vindictive. It was a legal structure built on precedent, designed to activate when specific measurable conditions were met. Those conditions had been satisfied with mathematical precision. Delia filed the activation petition with probate court 3 days later. The brief she'd prepared was 47 pages long, each page building on the previous one like floors in a building constructed from case law and documentation. The first section established that I had provided 72% of financial and caregiving support to family members over the past 5 years, well above the 60% threshold specified in Grandma's trust. My spreadsheets, the same ones from the Burgundy folder, served as exhibits. A through M, every hospital bill, every home repair, every debt cleared, every crisis managed, all documented with the precision that had become my professional signature. The second section proved the public humiliation requirement. Ruth's phone recording from Thanksgiving captured everything 12 witnesses present. 7 hands raised in a formal vote to exclude me from family gatherings. Kayla's announcement delivered with the ceremonial weight of a court proceeding. The recording was time-stamped, the audio clear enough that every word could be transcribed. Illinois law defined public humiliation as an act witnessed by 5 or more people or documented in a public forum. The Thanksgiving vote exceeded that threshold by more than double. The judge was a woman in her late 60s named Margaret Kowalski, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed Delia's brief in chambers. Ruth and I sat across from her desk while she read in silence, her pen occasionally making notes in the margins. The wall clock ticked through 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours. Finally, she set down the brief, looked at me over her glasses, and asked a single question. "Are you prepared for the responsibility this entails?" "Yes, Your Honor." I said, my voice steady. "I've been preparing for it most of my life, even though I didn't know that's what I was doing." She nodded once and signed the order. Legal transfer of management authority. Effective immediately for a 3-year term, with oversight by Ruth as trustee and quarterly auditing by an independent CPA firm that Delia had already retained. The estate. Grandma May's 20 acres, the investment accounts she'd built through decades of careful saving, the life insurance proceeds that had been held in trust, all of it shifted into my management with the stroke of a pen and the weight of judicial authority. But the transfer came with conditions that mattered more to me than the control itself. Minimum 25% of all estate income had to fund transparent community initiatives, the Heating Assistance Fund, the church food pantry, senior services programs that directly benefited people who needed help without requiring them to beg or prove their worthiness. This wasn't charity designed as a tax shelter or reputation management. It was obligation written into the structure as accountability, ensuring that the resources served purposes larger than any individual family member's wants. I'd already drafted the implementation structure during the days while Delia prepared the court filing. Public quarterly reports would be posted both at the church and on a simple website showing every dollar received and every dollar distributed. Frank Morrison, the retired accountant who chaired the church finance committee, had volunteered to serve as co-administrator after learning the truth about Trent's theft. He would review the books independently, sign off on every quarterly report, provide the kind of oversight that makes embezzlement nearly impossible. "The land doesn't belong to one house," I told Delia as we left the courthouse. "It belongs to a town." Grandma understood that. She never saw the estate as something to hoard for her descendants. She saw it as something to steward for her community. "That's what I'm going to do." Delia smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged principle being chosen over profit. "You could have structured this differently, taken full control without the community obligation. The trust would have allowed it." "I know," I said, "but then I'd be treating this as personal victory instead of what it actually is, responsibility transferred to someone who won't abuse it. I'm not going to win this by becoming what they are." The formal notification went out via certified mail the following morning. Kayla signed for hers at 11:32 according to the tracking receipt. She called Trent immediately, I knew, because her phone records would later show a 17-minute call placed at 11:34. I wasn't on that call, but I could imagine Trent's face going ashen as Kayla explained through hysterical tears that the land he'd spent 18 months positioning to acquire was now locked under management. He couldn't touch, controlled by the woman he'd tried to isolate and discredit, overseen by a trustee who'd survived an identical con 26 years earlier. Nathan Reeves went silent after that. The developer who'd orchestrated everything from behind his corporate curtain suddenly pulled back, canceling meetings, postponing acquisition discussions with adjacent landowners, retreating into whatever hole people crawl into when their long cons collapse. But even in his silence, you could hear hinges creaking backstage, the sound of machinery being dismantled, of plans being abandoned or reformulated. He'd invested significant money into this scheme, the PR firm, the payments to Trent, the time spent researching and planning. Now the land was untouchable for at least 3 years, possibly longer if I proved competent as a manager, and the trustee managing oversight was someone who knew exactly what to look for because she'd been his prototype victim decades ago. I didn't feel triumph sitting in my kitchen that evening, looking at the signed court order that transferred control. I felt the weight of a key being returned to its rightful lock, the sense of something being placed back in the hands of the person who knew how to keep the house standing without letting it collapse from neglect or be stripped for parts by opportunists. Responsibility doesn't feel like winning. It feels like carrying something heavy that you're finally strong enough to carry properly. I texted Ruth, "It's done." Her response came through 30 seconds later. "Not quite. Your father wants to meet privately." My phone rang before I could process what that meant. Dad's name on the screen. I answered, and his voice came through without preamble, without the softness that usually preceded difficult conversations. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, your house. Just you and me." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, understanding from his tone that whatever was coming wasn't congratulations or reconciliation or acknowledgement that I'd been right. Dad wanted to talk, and it wasn't to celebrate my victory. Dad arrived Saturday morning at 9:45, 15 minutes early, which wasn't like him. Punctuality had never been his strength, but apparently this conversation mattered enough to break pattern. He stood on my porch holding 2 paper cups from the coffee shop on Main Street, the kind of peace offering that's supposed to soften whatever hard conversation follows. I opened the door and let him in without comment. He settled into the kitchen chair where he'd sat dozens of times over the years. Family dinners, holiday preparations, casual visits that used to feel easy. But this morning, the air between us felt different, formal and transactional, like we were meeting in a conference room rather than my kitchen. He set one coffee in front of me and kept the other for himself, wrapping both hands around it as if the warmth mattered more than the caffeine. "You need to reconsider this whole situation," he said without preamble. "Think about your sister's future. Think about the family she wants to build. She's talking about having a baby with Trent Miranda, a grandchild. Think about what you're doing to that child's future by being so rigid about all this." The language was familiar, worn smooth from decades of use. Appeals to duty, to family unity, to the idea that being strong means accommodating endlessly, that being the responsible one means absorbing everyone else's consequences without complaint. I'd heard variations of this speech my entire life delivered in different contexts, but always with the same underlying message. Your strength exists to serve other people's weakness, and objecting to that arrangement makes you selfish. I'd prepared for this conversation. I stood and retrieved a folder from the counter different from the burgundy evidence folder, this one a simple gray, with a label printed in clean block letters, "Restoration Plan." I placed it in front of him and opened it to the first page. "This is what I'm offering," I said. "A structured repayment schedule, monthly installments over 5 years at 3% interest, which is below market rate. Mandatory financial counseling through a certified nonprofit program, attending sessions twice monthly for the first year, then monthly for 2 years after that." 100 hours of documented community service which she can fulfill through the church or other local organizations. Everything tracked, everything verified, everything designed to teach actual skills instead of just bailing her out again. Dad flipped through the pages without really reading them, his jaw tight. This is too harsh. She's your sister. She made mistakes, but you're treating her like a criminal. I raised you better than this. The words hung between us like smoke, visible but intangible, filling the space with something that made breathing harder. I felt the old familiar pull, the gravity of conditioning that had shaped my entire life. The guilt that said enforcing consequences made me the bad guy. The training that insisted love means erasing yourself to protect others from their own choices. But something had shifted in me over the past few weeks, crystallized in courtrooms and lawyers' offices and quiet moments where I'd had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. You raised me to be responsible, I said quietly. To honor my commitments, to tell the truth, to work hard to take care of the people who needed help. I'm doing exactly what you taught me. The difference is that I'm doing it with boundaries now. I'm offering restoration, not a free pass. She can earn back trust through actions, through demonstrating change, not through me pretending nothing happened and enabling the same patterns that got us here. My phone rang, the sound sharp in the kitchen's tension. Kayla's name on the screen. I answered on speaker, setting the phone on the table between Dad and me. Miranda? Kayla's voice came through, pitched too high, a forced laugh edging into desperation. Dad told me about your little meeting. I just want you to know, you think you've won. You think controlling Grandma's money makes you powerful. You'll regret this. You'll regret hurting your family like this. Don't think for a second that this is over. The threat was hollow, the bluster of someone watching control slip away and grasping at intimidation because manipulation had failed. But it was revealing too. This was who they were when consequences arrived, when the person they'd always counted on stopped cooperating with her own exploitation. I ended the call without responding, pressed the power button, and set the phone face down. My hands didn't shake. I didn't feel the need to defend or explain or engage with threats that had no substance behind them. Dad stared at the phone like it had betrayed him by speaking truth he didn't want to hear. I stood and walked to the front door, opening it in a gesture that was both respectful and final. I would honor him as my parent would give him the courtesy of dignified exit rather than escalated argument. But I wouldn't surrender to him as if he had authority over my adult choices, wouldn't let his discomfort with boundaries convince me that boundaries were wrong. I love you, Dad, I said, my voice steady. But I won't confuse love with enabling. I won't pretend that rescuing people from their own choices is the same as caring about them. This plan offers Kayla a real chance to change if she's willing to do the work. But I can't want her recovery more than she does. He stood, leaving both coffee cups on the table, neither of them touched. He walked past me without meeting my eyes, and I watched him get into his truck and pull away from my curb. The coffee cups sat on my table for an hour afterward, growing cold before I finally poured them down the sink. That afternoon, I called a locksmith. New deadbolts on the front and back doors upgraded to commercial grade. A smart lock installed on the front door with a code I could change remotely if needed. I drove to Delia's office and transferred all original documents to her firm's secure storage. The burgundy folder's contents: Grandma's trust documents, Ruth's historical records, everything that mattered existed now in fireproof safes and digital backups in locations my family couldn't access. That evening, I sat at my dining table and opened the journal I'd kept sporadically for years, writing in it only when life felt too large for my head to contain alone. I wrote, "New boundaries starting today. Love doesn't require me to be smaller so others can stay irresponsible. Protection isn't the same as punishment. And peace has a sound, the click of a lock turning once firmly into place." I made dinner for myself afterward, just a simple pasta with vegetables, nothing elaborate. But the act felt revolutionary in its smallness. For once I wasn't cooking to serve others, wasn't planning around someone else's preferences or dietary restrictions or arrival time. I was cooking because I wanted to eat because I was hungry, because taking care of myself was as legitimate as all the years I'd spent taking care of everyone else. I ate slowly, tasting every bite, and felt something that might have been the beginning of actual peace. That night, just after 11, a rock smashed through my living room window. Glass exploded inward, scattering across my floor in pieces that caught the streetlight like scattered stars. Taped to the rock was a note. The handwriting rushed and angry. "You'll regret this on Sunday." I called the police immediately after finding the rock and the note, and they arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers documented everything with the methodical efficiency of people who'd seen enough domestic disputes to know which details would matter later in court. The glass scattered across my living room floor caught the beam of their flashlights like frozen tears, thousands of tiny reflections that had been a single window an hour ago. They photographed the rock, the note still taped to it with clear packing tape, the trajectory of the throw, the size of the hole in my window. Everything went into evidence bags. Everything got logged with case numbers and timestamps. I was giving my statement when Mr. Alvarez knocked on my door. He lived 3 houses down, a retired postal worker in his early 70s who'd organized the neighborhood watch program 5 years ago after a series of car break-ins. He was holding a thermos of coffee in one hand and a small USB drive in the other. "My security camera caught something around 11:47, he said, handing me the drive. "Can't see a face. Whoever it was wore a hood, but I got the car. Partial plate make and model visible enough to identify." He poured coffee into the lid of his thermos and handed it to me, the gesture simple but steadying. "It's a dark blue Honda Civic, looks like a 2019 or 2020 model. Plate starts with J73. One of the officers took the USB drive, pulled up the footage on his laptop right there in my living room. The video showed exactly what Mr. Alvarez had described: a car pulling up at 11:47 p.m., idling with lights off, someone in a hooded sweatshirt getting out, arm drawing back and releasing, then scrambling back into the car and driving away quickly. The partial plate was visible in 2 frames where the street light hit it right. The officer radioed in the information and came back 10 minutes later. With a match, the vehicle was registered to someone named Derek Patterson, who I didn't know until the officer mentioned he was listed as a business partner in Trent's Real Estate LLC. Mr. Alvarez's wife Maria appeared at my door around midnight carrying a tin of homemade cookies, the kind with powdered sugar that she made for every neighborhood gathering. "You eat something," she said in her accented English, pressing the tin into my hands. "You need energy for tomorrow." Those small gestures, coffee cookies, camera footage, formed structural support that felt stronger than any grand promises or dramatic declarations of loyalty. Community, I realized, wasn't just a word in trust documents or a line item in quarterly reports. It was Mr. Alvarez staying in my living room until the emergency glass company arrived at 7 in the morning, helping me sweep up the smaller pieces while we waited, telling me stories about his years as a postal carrier, to fill the silence with something other than fear. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of pale winter light that makes everything look washed out and temporary. I'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep, and I was standing in my kitchen making more coffee when I saw Kayla's car pull up outside. She got out with someone I didn't recognize at first, a man in his 50s carrying a toolbox wearing a polo shirt with a locksmith company logo embroidered on the chest. I watched through my window as Kayla gestured at my front door, showing the locksmith something on her phone. I opened the door before they could knock. "I have partial ownership of this property," Kayla announced. Her voice pitched loud enough for neighbors to hear. "I'm exercising my right to access." She held up her phone, showing the locksmith a photograph of what was supposedly a quitclaim deed, the image so blurry I could barely make out the text, let alone verify any signatures or notarization. The locksmith, a professional who'd clearly seen his share of domestic disputes, looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see original documentation. Notarized deed title, something official. I can't just take someone's word and a phone photo." Kayla couldn't produce it, of course, because it didn't exist. I pulled out my phone, calmly dialed the non-emergency police line, and explained the situation in the same level voice I used when explaining tax strategies to clients. Just facts, no emotion, no drama. A woman is attempting to gain access to my property with fraudulent documentation. I need an officer to respond. The dispatcher said someone would be there shortly. Kayla's performance shifted immediately into theatrical desperation. "You see," she said to the locksmith to the neighbors who'd started appearing on porches and in doorways to anyone who would listen. "She's calling the police on her own sister. This is what she does. She uses her money and her lawyers to bully people." The officers arrived in 12 minutes. They reviewed the situation with professional detachment, asked to see my deed and title, which I had copies of readily available, asked Kayla for her documentation, which she couldn't produce beyond the blurry photo that the officers immediately identified as insufficient. The locksmith apologized to everyone involved and left without touching my locks, driving away in his van with the company logo displayed prominently on the side. Kayla broke down on my front lawn, tears streaming, voice carrying across the quiet Sunday morning neighborhood. "She's destroying our family. Everything Grandma built. She's taking it all for herself. She won't even help her own sister." The performance was desperate and public and calculated to generate sympathy from people who didn't know the actual story. But it was also documented because my doorbell camera had been recording since the moment her car pulled up, capturing every word, every gesture, every false claim she'd made. I didn't go outside. I didn't yell back or try to defend myself to the neighbors or engage with Kayla's performance. I just stood inside my doorway, watched the officers advise her to leave the property, and closed the door when she finally got back in her car and drove away. Then I forwarded the complete doorbell footage to Delia with a timestamp and a brief description of events. Delia's assistant called me an hour later to say she was creating a formal harassment log, a document that would track every incident with dates, times, witnesses, and police report numbers. Every escalation was becoming evidence. Every threat was transforming into documentation that would matter when we needed it to matter in courtrooms where facts weighed more than performances. Meanwhile, outside my windows, winter was deepening. The temperature had dropped into the teens overnight, and the forecast predicted a cold snap that would last through the week. The community heating fund that I'd quietly sustained for 6 years would prove its value, now keeping furnaces running in homes where elderly people lived on fixed incomes, where young families struggled to choose between heating and groceries. The people who'd believed the lies about me would see their heating bills covered by funds I'd established, managed, and protected. They'd see who had actually been working for the community while others had been stealing from it. I swept up the last fragments of glass from my living room floor, finding tiny pieces in corners and under furniture that the earlier cleaning had missed. The window was temporarily patched with plywood professional repair scheduled for Monday morning. I sat in my quiet house as afternoon light faded, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, feeling the accumulated weight of 3 weeks that had contained more conflict than the previous 3 years. I was tired, but I wasn't breaking. Sunday came, and with it, smoke. The smoke smell hit me first, acrid and wrong, cutting through the Sunday evening quiet at 9:34. I was reading in my living room, the plywood-patched window, a reminder of the rock from the night before, when the scent registered as something more dangerous than a neighbor's fireplace. I moved to the back of the house and saw through the kitchen window an orange glow coming from behind my garage, flames climbing higher than they should, licking at the vinyl siding. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from under my kitchen sink, the one I'd bought years ago, and hoped never to use, and ran outside. The fire was in my garbage bin, flames reaching 4 feet high, the plastic melting and producing thick black smoke that carried the chemical smell of burning petroleum. I pulled the pin aimed at the base of the flames the way the label instructed and squeezed. White foam erupted, covering the fire, smothering it section by section until the flames died into smoldering residue that hissed and steamed in the cold night air. My hands shook afterward, adrenaline flooding my system and then crashing into exhaustion as my body realized the immediate danger had passed. The fire department arrived within minutes, called by Mr. Alvarez, who'd seen the glow from his back window and responded faster than I'd managed to call them myself. 3 firefighters checked the scene, used thermal cameras to make sure nothing was still burning inside the walls or under the siding, and confirmed what I already suspected: arson. They found evidence of accelerant, the chemical signature of lighter fluid splashed liberally around the bin before ignition. Mr. Alvarez's security cameras, the same system that had caught the rock thrower the night before, had captured this too. The footage showed a car idling at the mouth of the alley behind my house at 9:31, 3 minutes before I'd smelled the smoke. Someone in a dark hoodie emerged, walked quickly toward my property line, arm moving in a throwing motion, then the sudden flare of ignition before the figure ran back to the car. The license plate was partially visible in 2 frames, and this time the match came back quickly. The same Honda Civic registered to Derek Patterson, Trent's business partner. Police collected samples of the accelerant, took my statement, took Mr. Alvarez's statement, downloaded the security footage as evidence, and opened a criminal investigation. This wasn't harassment anymore, or civil disputes over family money. This was arson, a felony with prison time, attached, the kind of escalation that moves cases from family court to criminal court, where the rules are different and the consequences more severe. The smell of burnt plastic clung to my coat even after I'd stripped it off and left it on the back porch. I sat on my back steps while firefighters packed up their equipment, watching them work with the efficient coordination of people who'd done this hundreds of times. I thought about all the times I'd figuratively extinguished family fires through silence, through absorbing anger and dysfunction, and letting it burn itself out inside me where no one else would have to feel the heat. I understood now that silence had sometimes been gasoline feeding flames, rather than smothering them, letting small problems grow into infernos, because I'd been too afraid of confrontation to grab the extinguisher when the fires were still containable. By Monday morning, Trent had launched his social media counterattack with the subtlety of someone who'd never had to face real consequences before. His posts were vague but pointed implications without direct accusations, designed to plant doubt while maintaining deniability. Interesting how some people create drama for attention. One post read, "When someone stages incidents to play victim, ask yourself who benefits," said another. The comments sections filled with people who didn't know the actual story, who responded to innuendo because innuendo feels sophisticated, like you're seeing through something that simpler people miss. But the church community had already seen Delia's documentation. They'd reviewed the heating fund discrepancies, seen the evidence of Trent's theft, watched the narrative shift from accusation to proof. People who'd initially clicked like on the anonymous blog posts about me now hesitated when Trent's new posts appeared. A like had become socially expensive, carrying implications about whose side you were on in a dispute where one side had documentation and the other had performance. I watched people self-edit in real time, watched the speed of rumor change as it tried to run while carrying the weight of evidence on its back. The narrative was limping now, wounded by its own contradictions. I didn't respond to any of it online, didn't post my side of the story, or try to argue with people who'd already decided. I just forwarded Trent's posts to Delia with a brief note, "Evidence of consciousness of guilt." She replied, "Perfect. Save everything." Then, at 11 o'clock Monday night, my phone rang with Dad's number. His voice came through broken in a way I'd never heard before, cracking on words that should have been simple. "Your mother collapsed. We're at Memorial Hospital. She's stable now, but she's asking for you. Can you come?" I set everything down the laptop where I'd been documenting the arson investigation, the folder of legal papers Delia had sent over the anger that had been keeping me warm through the cold precision of the past 3 weeks. I grabbed my coat, the one that didn't smell like smoke, and drove to the hospital through freezing rain that had turned to sleet, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always smell: antiseptic and anxiety, the particular combination of cleaning products and human fear that no amount of air freshening can cover. Dad met me in the hallway outside Mom's room, and for the first time in my memory, he looked old. Really old. Not just aged, but diminished by the weight of consequences he'd spent decades pretending wouldn't arrive. Mom looked small in the hospital bed, much smaller than she should have been, her body somehow taking up less space than the architecture around it allowed. White sheets, white walls, the beige of medical equipment, her skin nearly matching the pillowcase. An IV ran into her left arm. Monitors beeped their steady rhythm, and her eyes were closed when I first entered the room. But she must have sensed my presence because they opened, found me, and filled immediately with tears. Her hand reached out, thin and trembling liver spots visible on skin that had once seemed timeless to my child's eyes. I took it, felt the fragility of bones that had once seemed solid enough to hold up the world. This was the hand that had raised me, that had failed to protect me, that had been weaponized against me by people who understood how to use a mother's love as leverage. The same hand, all of those things simultaneously not reconcilable into a single narrative of good or bad, but existing as the complicated truth that people are rarely only one thing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so quiet I had to lean close to hear it over the monitor's beeping. "I'm so tired, Miranda. I'm so tired of all of this." I stroked her hair, the motion automatic and old, remembered from childhood when roles were reversed and she'd comforted me through nightmares and scraped knees and the small devastations of growing up. Love and justice. I understood then sometimes have to stand in the same room without resolving into one thing, without becoming either pure forgiveness or pure accountability, but remaining in the tension between both. In the hospital's antiseptic smell, Dad finally confessed something he should have said 10 years ago. Dad pulled me into the hallway, while Mom dozed, the fluorescent lights humming their constant electric drone above us, vending machines glowing against the far wall with their inventory of candy bars and coffee that tasted like regret. He looked at the floor, at his hands, at anything except my face, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he'd been carrying alone for too long. "There's something I should have told you years ago," he said. "When Kayla was 23, going through that rough patch after she dropped out of college the second time she needed money. I let her open a credit card in your name, just temporarily, I thought. She promised she'd pay it off before you ever knew." He paused, swallowed hard. "The debt hit $8,400. I came to you, asked you to handle it, but I told you it was probably identity theft or a clerical error. You paid it off in 2017, never questioned it, and I let you believe the lie because telling the truth would have meant upsetting your mother during her recovery from surgery." The memory came back sharp and clear, the credit card statement that had arrived with my name, but an account I'd never opened, the hours I'd spent on the phone with the credit card company, the decision to just pay it rather than fight it because fighting felt exhausting and paying felt efficient. Another invisible act of sacrifice that I'd absorbed like a sponge soaking water, never wringing out, just holding weight until I reached saturation. "I should have told you," Dad said, finally meeting my eyes. "I took the easy way. I always took the easy way when it came to Kayla, and I made you pay for my cowardice. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough to undo the damage or erase the pattern, but it was truth, and truth was at least a starting point for something that might eventually become repair." The doctor found me in the hallway an hour later, her voice clinical but not unkind. "Your mother's episode was stress-induced. Her heart is stable for now, but any further emotional upheaval could trigger something worse, potentially a full cardiac event. Stress reduction isn't just good advice, it's medicine. She needs peace, not drama." I texted Delia from the hospital parking lot. "Pause any public filings. Continue the legal track quietly, but no press, no public statements until Mom is stable. Family first." Her response came through immediately. "Understood. We don't sacrifice family for justice, we separate them carefully. All proceedings will continue, but silently." I stayed at the hospital that night, sleeping in the bedside recliner that advertised itself as comfortable, but delivered something closer to strategic torture, my neck bent at an angle that would take days to forgive. I read aloud to Mom from papers I'd brought, the quarterly heating fund report with its mundane numbers and recipient thank you notes, stories of seniors whose furnaces stayed running through the cold snap families, whose children got winter coats through the clothing drive, small victories that added up to people staying warm and fed. Mom listened with her eyes closed, her breathing steadying into the rhythm of something closer to actual rest. Sometimes justice has to wait so that hearts don't break beyond any possibility of repair. Kayla appeared Tuesday morning, mascara smudged down her cheeks, crying in the hallway outside Mom's room, where nurses passed with carefully neutral expressions. I handed her a tissue from the box on the waiting room table. Not an embrace, not forgiveness, but not a door slammed in her face either. "I need help," she said, her voice stripped of performance, raw in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "Please, Miranda." I pulled out the restoration plan, now updated with one addition: mandatory participation in family therapy, facilitated by a licensed counselor, sessions required monthly for at least a year. "This is the door," I said. "You can walk through it or you can walk away, but you can't stay in the hallway anymore." Kayla took the paper with shaking hands and nodded. Whether the nod meant actual commitment or just another performance would be revealed only with time and actions that followed words. The next morning, the bank called about a suspicious transaction on the family trust account. The bank's call about the suspicious transaction would have to wait, because Wednesday afternoon, Mom asked me to sit close beside her hospital bed, her voice stronger than it had been since she'd collapsed. "I need to tell you something about that recording," she said, and I leaned in, expecting another apology or explanation about how Trent had manipulated her. Instead, she said something that rewired my understanding of the past 6 months. "You think I didn't know Trent was recording when he had me call you?" Her eyes were clear now, focused in a way they hadn't been during the confusion and tears of the past few days. "In March, I found your small recording device in your coat pocket when I was doing laundry. The little digital recorder you keep for meetings. I didn't say anything because I understood immediately why you had it. You were protecting yourself the way I'd never learned to protect myself." I sat completely still, processing what she was telling me. "So when Trent came over in May and made me practice what to say to you, when I saw his phone sitting on the kitchen table with the recording app open, I knew exactly what was happening. He thought he was coaching me to manipulate you. But I knew you'd be recording too." She paused, gathering strength. "I spoke slowly. I spoke clearly. I made sure every word would be captured. I made sure you'd have evidence not just of what I said, but of him feeding me lines in the background." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her eyes held something I hadn't seen in them for years, maybe decades: agency, the look of someone who'd made a choice instead of having choices made around them. "I wasn't strong enough to confront Trent directly," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Decades of avoiding conflict, of keeping peace by staying quiet, of being sick and tired and scared, all of that meant I couldn't be the daughter you needed me to be, the mother who stands up and fights. But I could do this. I could be the evidence. I could let them think I was the weak link, while actually creating the strongest proof you'd need later." The revelation reframed everything I'd believed about that phone call, about my mother's role in the manipulation. She hadn't been simply a victim weaponized against me. She'd been playing a longer game than anyone realized, using the only power available to her, her own compliance, and turning it into something that would protect her daughter. "I couldn't fight like you," Mom whispered, reaching for my hand. "But I could be the proof you needed." I embraced her then carefully because of the IV and monitors, and cried for the first time in 8 weeks. Not from pain or anger or exhaustion, but from recognition. This wasn't just my victory. It was 2 generations of women finding different ways to fight the same battle, each playing to the strengths they actually possessed, instead of the strengths they wished they had. Strength, I understood now, came in more forms than I'd been taught to recognize. Not just in confrontation and boundary setting, but in strategic surrender that gathered evidence in weakness that was actually witness. I heard movement in the doorway and looked up to see Dad standing there, his face showing that he'd heard everything. He didn't speak, but his hand reached out and touched Mom's shoulder gently, a gesture of respect and recognition that should have been his default for decades, but was arriving now, late, but real. The 3 of us sat in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the distant hallway noises of a hospital at mid-afternoon. I realized that justice wasn't about perfect people making perfect choices. It was about flawed people finally choosing growth over comfort, truth over the convenient lies that had sustained dysfunctional peace. This moment, quiet, unwitnessed except by fluorescent lights and a wall-mounted TV playing muted news, mattered more than any courtroom drama, because this was where actual healing started, in admitting that everyone had failed in their own ways, and everyone could still choose differently going forward. Mom had been fighting all along, just in a language I'd forgotten how to read. But someone else hadn't forgotten how to fight at all. While Mom recovered in the hospital and the legal machinery continued its quiet work, I launched the restructured heating fund exactly as I'd promised in the trust activation documents. Full transparency wasn't a marketing strategy. It was the foundation. Quarterly reports posted on the church bulletin board and uploaded to a simple website that showed every dollar received and every dollar distributed. An independent regional CPA firm conducted audits, their reports public and detailed. Frank Morrison co-signed every distribution check, his reputation as a retired accountant, adding a layer of verification that made fraud nearly impossible. The first winter distribution went to 43 households during January's brutal cold snap, when temperatures stayed below 20 degrees for 8 consecutive days. Seniors whose fixed incomes couldn't stretch to cover heating bills received checks that kept their furnaces running. Young families choosing between groceries and gas bills got relief that meant their children stayed warm. The thank you cards started arriving in my mailbox within days. Handwritten notes on drugstore stationery, some in shaky cursive from arthritic hands. "You saved us." "God bless you." "We would have frozen without this help." The community was learning to trust again, but not through words or promises or social media posts about values and commitments. They learned through sight and touch and the physical reality of checks that cleared and heat that flowed and children who didn't shiver at night. They saw the numbers. They felt the warmth. They witnessed accountability in real time. Every Saturday morning, Ruth and I volunteered at the church food pantry, arriving at 7 to help unload the delivery truck and stock shelves before the doors opened at 9. We organized donations, carried boxes for elderly people whose arms couldn't manage the weight-bagged groceries for families who needed the help. It was boring, repetitive work, exactly the kind that doesn't photograph well for social media, but actually matters to people who are hungry. Mr. Alvarez installed additional security lighting behind my house, motion-activated floods that would make any future arson attempt visible from 3 blocks away. He refused payment, said it was what neighbors do. Mrs. Chen organized a meal train when I caught the flu in late January, a rotation of homemade soup and casseroles that appeared on my doorstep with notes saying, "Rest, we've got you." Pastor Mike quietly corrected misinformation when he heard it not dramatically but persistently, the way you correct a fact that's simply wrong without making it a confrontation. The narrative shifted organically, not through any campaign I orchestrated, but through the steady accumulation of actions that contradicted the lies. People stopped asking, "What's wrong with her?" and started noticing, "What has she been doing for us?" Trust rebuilt itself through small reliabilities, repeated until they became patterns through consistency that was too boring to be performance. It was the kind of reputation recovery that doesn't make headlines, but actually lasts. In early February, the developer's PR operation collapsed completely. Nathan Reeves's shell company withdrew all funding from Velocity Communications, severing the financial trail that had supported the smear campaign. The anonymous blog that had accused me of elder abuse issued a terse lawyer-written statement. "Inaccuracies were published in a previous post. We regret the error," before going permanently offline, the domain registration lapsing into expired status. Delia filed the retraction and the payment records evidence preserved, even though the original accusations had been scrubbed from the internet. I didn't push for more public vindication, didn't demand apologies or corrections from everyone who'd believed the lies. I'd won where it actually counted in structures that would outlast any news cycle in relationships rebuilt through actions instead of explanations. I didn't need a parade or viral redemption story. I needed to walk through the grocery store without lowering my eyes, to sit in church without whispers following me down the aisle, to sleep at night without wondering if my windows would shatter or my garbage bins would burn. Those small dignities recovered quietly, and maintained through consistent behavior were worth more than any amount of social media vindication. Then came the second email from the bank. The test withdrawal attempt had become something far more sophisticated. The bank's forensic audit revealed something far more methodical than a single desperate grab at money. Over 7 weeks spanning October through mid-November 2024, there had been 12 separate test transactions, small amounts like $47, $83, $125 withdrawn from the trust account and returned within 48 hours. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone probing the account's security systems like a thief testing doorknobs along a street, checking which ones were locked and which ones might give way with the right pressure. The $75,000 wire transfer attempt hadn't been impulsive. It had been the culmination of weeks of careful reconnaissance. The forensic accountant traced the temporary holding account to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, which led through subpoenaed banking records to an LLC in Delaware, which finally connected directly to Reeves Development Group. The digital fingerprints were everywhere once you knew where to look. Kayla's laptop showed login sessions to the trust's online banking portal, matching 8 of the 12 test transactions. The timestamps and IP addresses documented with precision that left no room for claiming her computer had been hacked. Trent's phone GPS data placed him at locations corresponding to the IP addresses of the other 4 attempts, including one made from a coffee shop 2 blocks from his apartment at 2 a.m. The evidence formed a web so intricate and interconnected that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't untangle it without scissors that would leave obvious cuts. Delia prepared the criminal referral package over 3 days, building a case that included wire fraud charges at the federal level, identity theft, attempted embezzlement from a trust under Illinois felony statutes, and conspiracy charges that would apply to everyone involved. She walked the preliminary file to the district attorney's office, personally came back and told me it was prosecutable with potential sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years depending on how a judge weighed the aggravating factors. "You have all the leverage now," she said, sitting across from me in her office while winter sun came through the windows at that low, cold angle that makes everything look stark. "You can destroy them completely, or you can give them one chance to surrender with some dignity intact. It's your choice, and whatever you choose is justified." I thought about Grandma May's letter, the one from the tin box where she'd written that the real enemy isn't the person who hurts you, but the heart that turns to stone in response to being hurt. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Kayla. "Final offer? Admit everything. Enter mandatory financial counseling, structured repayment over 10 years, public apology at church. Or the DA receives this file Monday morning. You have 48 hours. The red receipt showed she'd seen it. No reply came. 24 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text containing a single photo, a positive pregnancy test on a bathroom counter, the 2 pink lines clearly visible. The caption read simply, "I'm pregnant." I stared at the image for 5 full minutes while my coffee went cold in its mug. The metadata showed the photo had been taken that morning, no evidence of manipulation or downloaded stock images. The baby growing inside my sister hadn't chosen this family, hadn't committed fraud, hadn't participated in schemes, or voted to exile anyone. The innocent were always collateral damage in wars fought by adults who should have known better. I called Delia immediately. "We're adding a condition to any settlement. Create a separate infant trust independent trustee, not related to either parent, completely isolated from Kayla and Trent's access funds, reserved strictly for documented education and health care expenses. The child gets protected from their parents' choices, but the parents still face full consequences for what they've done." Delia was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "You're a better person than most people would be in your position." "No," I said. "I'm just someone who remembers what it's like to pay for someone else's mistakes my entire life. That child won't start life already in debt to other people's bad decisions." I would help the baby, but I wouldn't let the adults escape accountability. While I was processing Kayla's pregnancy announcement, Delia turned to the final page of the corporate ownership documents we'd obtained through the subpoena process, and I heard her sharp intake of breath before she spoke. "Miranda, you need to see this." She slid the page across her desk toward me, her finger pointing to a name printed in official corporate registration, typeface CEO, and majority owner of Reeves Development Group, Nathan Reeves. The name detonated in my memory like a flashbang grenade, white light obliterating everything else for several seconds. College. Spring semester 2008. My senior year. Nathan Reeves had been the charismatic business major everyone wanted to be around, the guy who made entrepreneurship sound like destiny rather than risk. He'd pitched me on a startup that was going to revolutionize import-export logistics, needed $15,000 to secure office space and initial inventory. I was 22, still believed that trust was a virtue rather than a calculated risk, and I'd co-signed a personal loan because we were friends, and friends helped each other build futures. He'd made exactly 2 payments before vanishing completely. Changed his phone number, deleted every social media profile, moved out of state without forwarding address or explanation. I'd spent the next 2 years paying off that loan alone, $500 a month carved out of my starting salary at my first accounting job, never telling my family, because the shame of being fooled felt worse than the financial burden. I'd thought I'd buried that mistake under a decade and a half of better decisions, smarter choices, harder-won wisdom. But it had never been buried. It had just been dormant, waiting to metastasize into something far more dangerous. Delia pulled up the internal company emails we'd obtained through the subpoena, and the targeting became explicit in ways that made my hands go cold. An email from Nathan to Trent, dated July 2023, subject line, Shaw Project. Target M, Shaw CPA, age 36, controls family land trust, valued 2.4 m's. Weakness, pathological family loyalty. Research shows she always bails them out. Never says no when family needs money. Find the sister younger, financially irresponsible, needs validation. Get inside. Make Target think signing is about love, not land. Another email from Nathan to his business partner 3 weeks later. Shaw won't see it coming. She thinks I'm ancient history, probably doesn't even remember my name anymore. But I remember hers. I remember how easy it was to take her money the first time. She trusted too much, asked too few questions, signed because she wanted to believe in someone. That psychology doesn't change. This time we're not taking $15,000. We're taking land worth $2.4 million. This wasn't real estate development. It was revenge disguised as business. A 15-year grudge that had calcified into elaborate conspiracy because Nathan couldn't accept that expecting repayment of borrowed money wasn't betrayal. The emails revealed that Trent wasn't a boyfriend who happened to have real estate connections. He was a hired operative. Nathan had paid him $5,000 up front, plus promised 15% of final profits to get close to the Shaw family and gain access. Trent had researched Kayla's patterns, where she volunteered what causes she supported, which coffee shops she frequented, and engineered a chance meeting at a community fundraiser in August 2023. The 8-month courtship had been performance, every dinner and conversation and declaration of love, calculated to position him as family insider. The boutique dream, Nathan's concept, fed to Kayla through Trent in ways that made her think it was her own aspiration. The Thanksgiving vote, orchestrated specifically to isolate me to make family pressure feel like the only reasonable response to my controlling behavior. Every step had been chess played by someone who understood strategy and patience, and I had been the queen they were hunting across the board. I looked up at Delia and said, my voice flat and cold, "This wasn't family dysfunction. This was war." Nathan thought he was the only one who remembered that loan from 2008. He was wrong. And now he'd learn what 15 years of patience looks like when it finally moves. Understanding that Nathan had orchestrated everything from 15 years in the shadows didn't change what I had to do about Kayla's pregnancy, but it clarified why the decision mattered so much. I spent 2 days drafting a proposal for an infant protection trust, with Delia's legal guidance creating a structure that would shield an innocent child from the consequences of choices made before that child existed. The trustee would be a neutral third party, a family law attorney named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in child welfare cases and had no connection to either side of this conflict. Funds would be deposited quarterly from a dedicated account usable only for documented educational expenses, healthcare, and verified basic needs with receipts required for every withdrawal. Kayla and Trent could not access the money, could not borrow against it, could not dissolve the trust until the child turned 25, and could make informed decisions about their own financial future. Money for the child, not for the parents' mistakes, I explained to Delia as we finalized the language. The proposal was legally sound but emotionally devastating in what it implied that Kayla couldn't be trusted with resources meant for her own baby. The implication was both true and brutal, a single sentence that bisected the entangled roots of pity and justice love the child but don't enable the adults. Kayla initially agreed, came to Delia's office, and signed the preliminary documents with hands that shook hard enough to make her signature barely legible. Then she called me that night and we spent 3 hours on the phone while she oscillated between what sounded like genuine remorse and manipulation tactics I'd heard variations of my entire life. "You're controlling my baby's life before it's even born," she sobbed. "You're punishing an innocent child for my mistakes. How can you be so cruel?" Dad called the next morning to tell me that Trent had contacted him calling the infant trust financial abuse disguised as help, and claiming I was using legal mechanisms to continue controlling the family even into the next generation. Delia's response when I forwarded her the message was clinically precise. "The court hears numbers, not tears. If they reject these terms, we proceed to prosecution. They can co-parent from prison if they prefer, but that won't benefit the child either." The words were harsh but necessary, the kind of clarity that cuts through emotional fog to expose the actual choices available. I held firm. Sign the complete restoration agreement structured repayment plan, mandatory financial counseling, public apology, and infant trust, or I would authorize Delia to file everything with the district attorney's office. Not both options. Not neither. Choose one path or the other. The deadline was Friday at 5 p.m. No extensions, no negotiations beyond what was already on the table. Mom called from the hospital Thursday afternoon, still under observation, but strong enough to speak with the clarity I'd heard in her confession about the recording. "Do what's right, not what's easy," she said, her voice carrying authority I hadn't heard from her in decades. The weight of someone who'd finally stopped choosing comfort over truth. Those 7 words became my compass for the next 24 hours. I texted Delia, "If they don't sign by deadline, file everything with the DA, no extensions." Then I made soup, the kind Grandma used to make with chicken and vegetables and egg noodles, and watched snowfall outside my kitchen window while the broth simmered. I thought about how doing the right thing shouldn't require this much pain, shouldn't feel this heavy and lonely and hard. But maybe that's how you recognize the right thing, because the wrong thing always feels easier in the moment, smoother and warmer and less isolating. Courage, I understood then, was just fear that had done its homework, that had studied the options and chosen the harder path because it led somewhere worth reaching. Friday at 4:53 p.m. Kayla signed, 7 minutes before the deadline. The right thing walked into court the following Monday, navy blazer, low heels, and a 2-inch folder. The courtroom was exactly what courtrooms always are. Wood paneling that had absorbed decades of testimony, industrial cleaner, trying unsuccessfully to mask the smell of old radiators and human anxiety fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Delia opened our case like a metronome, finding its tempo steady and precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to be with no decoration or wasted syllables. She presented the timeline first, establishing October through November 2024 as the period when 12 test transactions occurred, then the $75,000 wire attempt. Dollar amounts came next, specific to the penny. Then signatures on documents, video evidence, time-stamped and verified expert testimony from the forensic accountant who explained digital fingerprints in language accessible to people who'd never heard the term IP address before. No adjectives colored her presentation. No emotional appeals asked the judge to feel something about the facts. Just the facts themselves delivered in sequence on this date. This person performed this action. Here is the documentation proving it happened exactly as described. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Margaret Kowalski, reading glasses hanging on a silver chain around her neck, taking notes in cursive so neat it looked like calligraphy. Delia moved through exhibits A through Z, like someone building a bridge from concrete and steel. Not beautiful, but unquestionably solid, capable of bearing weight without collapsing under scrutiny. The evidence spoke the language courts understand best. Timestamps that couldn't be argued with account numbers that existed in bank databases, sworn affidavits that carried the penalty of perjury. The defense attorney, a man named Robert Chen who specialized in white-collar cases, attempted character assassination as his opening strategy. He called me controlling, vindictive, someone whose documentation was obsessive rather than protective, whose insistence on accountability revealed psychological problems rather than reasonable boundaries. But every accusation crumbled when Delia responded with exhibit numbers. Your Honor, the defense characterizes financial responsibility and self-protection as personality flaws. We characterize them as wisdom learned through experience. Judge Kowalski looked over her reading glasses and said mildly, "Let's focus on facts. Counsel, not character assessments." The defense pivoted to emotional territory. Kayla's tears as she sat at the defendant's table. Trent's rehearsed expression of remorse the pregnancy offered as mitigating circumstance that should inspire mercy. None of it addressed the central question Judge Kowalski would have to answer. Did these defendants attempt to defraud a trust through systematic testing of security systems, followed by a large, unauthorized wire transfer? The answer, documented across 47 pages of evidence that Delia had organized with color-coded tabs, was unambiguously yes. The courtroom became a space where papers turning made more sound than voices, where truth had a physical texture. You could feel cotton fiber, laser-printed text, 3-hole punched, and indexed for easy reference. Delia's case unfolded chronologically, like a watch being assembled before the judge's eyes. The burgundy manila folder from Thanksgiving showing years of unpaid debts. Grandma May's tin box documents establishing the trust structure and character protection clause. The forged power of attorney with its amateur font inconsistencies. Bank records showing the test transactions. Payment receipts connecting Nathan Reeves to the anonymous blog. Email trails spelling out the conspiracy in the participants' own words. Security footage of the arson attempt, grainy but clear enough to identify the vehicle. Police reports filed by officers who'd documented everything with professional detachment. Each piece connected like gears in a watch mechanism individually, small, collectively creating movement that was greater than the sum of its parts. When Delia finished at 4:47 p.m., Judge Kowalski called recess until the following morning. I walked out of the courthouse into February cold, my breath visible in clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind. Delia walked beside me to the parking lot and said simply, "That's how it's done." No celebration, no excitement, just the professional satisfaction of someone who'd executed a job correctly and knew the quality of her own work. I drove home, microwaved leftover soup, and sat in my quiet house thinking about tomorrow, when I knew the hardest question would finally arrive. The next morning, after the defense rested its case, Judge Kowalski looked directly at me and asked, "Ms. Shaw, why didn't you report this earlier?" I looked directly at Judge Kowalski and answered the question that had been waiting for me since this whole process began. "Your Honor, I wanted to keep my family together. I believed that if I stayed quiet, stayed helpful, stayed patient enough, they'd eventually see my value. I thought love meant carrying weight silently without asking for recognition or relief. I was wrong." My voice didn't waver, though I felt my eyes glisten under the fluorescent courtroom lights that made everything look both too bright and too cold. I didn't report it earlier because I was raised to believe that family problems stay in the family, that airing grievances to outsiders is betrayal, that being strong means absorbing damage without complaint or boundaries. I stayed silent until they made silence impossible by turning my silence into permission for more harm. The courtroom had gone completely still. I saw a woman in the gallery, a stranger, gray-haired, probably someone's mother who'd come to watch court proceedings the way some people watch daytime television, press a tissue to her eyes. The space felt suddenly smaller, more intimate, as if the formal architecture had contracted around a truth that didn't need legal language to be understood. This wasn't just my story playing out in wooden pews and sworn testimony. It was a generation's story. Women taught that suffering was service, that boundaries were selfishness, that their pain was simply the admission price for being loved by people who confused exploitation with family. Judge Kowalski nodded slowly, removed her reading glasses, and delivered her ruling with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen this pattern play out in variations throughout her career. Temporary restraining order issued immediately, barring Kayla and Trent from contacting me, approaching my property, or attempting to access trust accounts through any means. Restitution ordered in the amount of $131,524.19 plus accumulated interest and reasonable legal fees payable in monthly installments over 10 years, with automatic wage garnishment provisions if payments lapsed. Criminal charges would proceed separately. Trent faced federal wire fraud charges being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the arson investigation remained open with grand jury proceedings pending. Kayla received a suspended sentence contingent on successful completion of court-mandated financial counseling, consistent restitution payments, and 0 further violations. The Infant Protection Trust was approved exactly as proposed, with Rebecca Chen appointed as independent trustee and funds protected from parental access until the child reached 25. The gavel struck once, not loud, not dramatic, but final in the way that matters. Like a church bell on Sunday morning, those who hear it know what it means without needing explanation. Outside the courthouse, snow had begun falling in fat flakes that accumulated on the steps and railings. A reporter from the local paper approached with a microphone asking if I had a statement. I stopped, looked at the camera, and said simply, "Love isn't a blank check. Compassion isn't blindness." My family mistook my silence for permission, and I mistook their taking for connection. I hope others won't make the same mistake on either side of that equation. I turned and walked to my car, my dark coat contrasting against the white snow that was beginning to cover everything. Feeling light in a way I hadn't felt in years, like a ballot finally cast in the correct box after standing in line so long you'd forgotten why you came. That night my phone buzzed with a text from Kayla. Just 3 words: "I need help." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then another message appeared. "I want to tell the truth. Help me." Kayla's text saying she wanted to tell the truth arrived on a Tuesday night, and by Thursday morning, Delia had prepared a carefully worded public statement for release to local media. The statement wasn't sensational or designed to generate outrage. It was factual, almost clinical in its precision. It summarized the court ruling, outlined the developers' funding of the anonymous smear campaign, and presented a clear timeline of the fraud attempts from October through November. Delia included redacted copies of Nathan Reeves' internal emails, removing any private information that wasn't relevant, but leaving the manipulation explicit and undeniable. The money trail from Reeves' development group through the PR firm to the anonymous blog was presented as a simple flowchart, the kind you could follow even if you'd never thought about corporate shell companies or how defamation campaigns get funded. The local newspaper ran it as a front-page story, not gossip or scandal, but a cautionary tale about estate protection and the vulnerability of families to outside manipulation. The television station did a 3-minute segment during the evening news. The community's response wasn't the explosive outrage I might have expected months ago. Instead, people nodded slowly when they read it, the way you nod when a confusing situation suddenly clarifies into sense. Truth doesn't always need amplification or drama. Sometimes it just needs a clear diagram and the space to speak for itself. But I didn't want this story to end with me positioned as some kind of hero who'd single-handedly saved the family estate from evil conspirators. That narrative was too simple and too dangerous, because it suggested that one righteous person with enough documentation could solve systemic problems. So I did something that surprised even Delia when I proposed it. I asked to expand the church finance committee to include two people who'd initially believed the anonymous blog's accusations against me, people who'd questioned my motives and wondered publicly if maybe I was the problem. I want oversight from people who will ask hard questions. I told Pastor Mike when we met in his office to discuss the heating fund's future structure. I want people on that committee who don't automatically trust me, who will demand receipts and explanations, and won't just take my word because I've been reliable in the past. The whole point of transparency is that it works even when people are skeptical. The heating fund's online portal was updated to show real-time donations and distributions, every dollar tracked from the moment it entered the system until it paid someone's heating bill. I scheduled quarterly town hall meetings at the church where anyone could come review the physical books, ask questions face-to-face, and raise concerns without needing to go through official channels first. I was building something larger than personal vindication or restored reputation. I was building a structure that couldn't be corrupted by any single person's silence or charisma or ability to manipulate through charm. Transparency wasn't a gift I was generously offering the community. It was a standard I was demanding from everyone involved, including and especially myself. Friday afternoon, another message arrived from Kayla. This one was longer, more specific. Can we meet just us, face to face? No Trent, no lawyers, no recording devices. I want to talk at Grandma May's table. Dawn before anyone else is awake. No phones. The request for Grandma's table told me something about Kayla's state of mind. That kitchen table where 3 generations had shared thousands of meals, where arguments had escalated and been resolved, where reconciliations had been negotiated over coffee and pie. The place held memory the way wood holds grain, visible in the patterns if you knew how to look. The location was an appeal to shared history, to a time before everything broke. I replied, Saturday, 6 a.m., I'll be there. But I also texted Ruth. Kayla wants to meet at the house, just the two of us, 6 a.m. Saturday. Can you be nearby? Not in the room, but close enough. Ruth responded immediately. I'll be in the living room. Door stays open. I texted Delia the same information, and she replied, I'll be parked outside. If anything feels wrong, you text me one word, coffee. I'll be inside in 30 seconds. Trust I'd learned through brutal experience wasn't about blind faith or assuming the best in people who'd proven themselves untrustworthy. It was about verification, appropriate boundaries, and backup plans that didn't require you to be paranoid, but simply prepared. I would extend one more hand toward my sister, would give her the chance she was asking for, to tell whatever truth she'd finally found the courage to speak. But I'd keep my other hand on the door ready to close it if what came through wasn't honesty, but another variation of manipulation I'd seen too many times before. Saturday morning arrived, cold and clear dawn just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when I pulled up to Ruth's house. The kitchen light was already on. I walked up the path I'd walked hundreds of times as a child, let myself in with the key Ruth had given me, and found the coffee already brewing. Then I heard a car door slam outside and heavy footsteps on the porch that weren't Kayla's. Trent had somehow learned about the meeting, and he'd decided to show up uninvited. Trent stood in the doorway, backlit by the pre-dawn gray, his presence transforming the kitchen from sanctuary into crime scene. But I didn't move, didn't flinch, because Delia had anticipated this possibility and planned accordingly. Saturday dawn had painted frost across the windows of Grandma May's house, the wooden table between Kayla and me serving as silent witness, the way it had witnessed 3 generations of family business. Kayla had arrived at 6:02, 2 minutes late, looking exhausted in ways that went beyond lack of sleep. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled into a messy ponytail, one hand resting unconsciously on her belly, where a barely visible curve suggested the future growing inside her. I'd arrived 15 minutes early, enough time to lay out the folder I'd prepared, thinner than the burgundy accusation from Thanksgiving, this one labeled simply Restoration Path in black permanent marker. Not a weapon. A roadmap. The terms were typed clearly on the first page: structured repayment from any legitimate boutique profits if she actually built 1 mandatory financial counseling sessions twice monthly for 2 years with a certified nonprofit counselor. Public apology, to be delivered at church, but written with therapist guidance, rather than performed for social media and formal execution of the infant trust paperwork that would protect her child from the consequences of choices made before that child existed. Morning light filtered through Ruth's lace curtains, gold and cold, simultaneously illuminating 2 women who were sisters by blood and strangers by choice, and survivors of the same broken family system. I spoke each term aloud slowly and clearly, giving Kayla time to absorb what each requirement meant and why it existed. No anger colored my voice, no triumph at having leverage. Just the steady tone of someone reading a contract, because contracts matter, because words on paper create accountability that verbal promises never deliver. "I still believe you can do better," I said, meeting her eyes across Grandma's table. "I believe in better, not in you as you've been." Kayla's eyes filled with tears that looked genuine for the first time in months. "Do you really think I can fix this?" The question came out naked and vulnerable, stripped of performance, maybe the first honest thing she'd said since August when this whole conspiracy began. "I believe in structured second chances," I replied, placing a pen on the table between us. "Sign and we start rebuilding with accountability. Don't sign and the legal process finishes what the court already started. Your choice." Kayla reached for the pen with a hand that shook visibly, picked up the first page and began reading. Actually reading, her eyes moving left to right, her lips forming some of the words silently, the way people do when they're processing something important. For once in her adult life, she was reading a document before signing it. Maybe that was growth. Maybe it was just fear of more consequences. Maybe growth always begins as fear that gets channeled into better choices. The back door exploded inward, wood frame splintering slightly where the lock gave way. Trent burst through, wild-eyed and desperate, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. He grabbed the folder off the table, papers scattering. "Nobody's taking my future," he shouted, his voice cracking on the last word. A chair toppled backward, hitting the floor with a crash that made Kayla flinch. But 2 figures emerged immediately from the doorway to the living room, where they'd been waiting in silence, plainclothes officers that Delia had arranged to be present with Sheriff Morrison's approval, given the active arson investigation and Trent's documented violations of the temporary restraining order. "Trent Dawson, you're under arrest for violation of a court order, attempted witness intimidation, and outstanding warrants related to federal wire fraud charges." The taller officer's voice was professionally calm, almost bored, the tone of someone who'd made 1,000 arrests and knew exactly how this would proceed. Handcuffs clicked into place with that distinctive metallic sound that means freedom ending. Trent's face cycled through emotions like someone flipping television channels, rage to panic, to disbelief, to something that might have been recognition that he'd finally run out of rooms to run into. Kayla slumped in her chair, put her head in her hands, and made a sound that wasn't quite crying, but wasn't quite anything else either. I stood motionless, watching officers lead Trent toward the front door, where a patrol car waited with its lights off to avoid drawing neighborhood attention. I felt no joy watching him arrested, no satisfaction or sense of victory. Just the quiet completion of someone who'd been carrying weight for so long that setting it down felt almost anticlimactic. Delia stepped into the doorway from outside where she'd been waiting in her car, nodded once, and I nodded back. It was over. After the police car pulled away, Kayla signed the restoration agreement, every page, every place marked for initials, every acknowledgement of terms and consequences. Her hand shook badly enough that some signatures barely resembled her name, but they were real, they were hers, and they were binding. Then I pulled out one more document, this one already executed and filed with the county 2 days earlier. A conservation easement converting Grandma May's 20 acres into May's Preserve, a protected space in perpetuity, unbuildable and unsellable, available for community gardens and family gatherings, but forever removed from the market where developers could measure it in dollars per square foot. No one can sell the memories now, I said quietly. Aunt Ruth, who'd been standing in the hallway throughout everything, stepped forward and placed her hand on my shoulder. Now the land belongs to the people who'll actually protect it. Outside, February wind scattered the last of winter's brown leaves across frozen ground, a gust carrying several through the open door into Grandma's kitchen, where they settled on the floor like small reminders that everything ends and everything changes, and sometimes that's the only way anything can move forward. 1 year later, an invitation arrived Thanksgiving dinner from the same people who'd voted me out. A year passed like seasons through a window, visible, inevitable, sometimes beautiful, in the way that change is beautiful even when it hurts. Spring brought the community garden at Maize Preserve, summer filled it with vegetables that seniors tended in raised beds. I'd helped fund Fall Harvested, what had been planted, and winter arrived again with its annual reminder that warmth is something you have to build and maintain, not something you can assume will always be there. The invitation came in a cream envelope that arrived on a Tuesday in mid-November, the handwriting immediately recognizable as Mom's careful cursive. "We voted for potluck. You bring the rolls. We'll bring the apologies." I read it twice, sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, and smiled a small, tired smile that wasn't bitter but wasn't entirely without edge either. Just worn and knowing the smile of someone who'd learned that some battles end not with trumpets, but with quiet acknowledgments that arrive a year late. Below Mom's signature, Kayla had added a note in pencil, her handwriting less practiced. "Mom's making her cranberry sauce again. She says it tastes better when everyone's at the table." Perhaps I thought they'd finally understood the value of an empty chair, not as threat or punishment, but as consequence. Not as exile imposed by cruelty, but as distance chosen by someone who'd finally learned that leaving is sometimes the only way to stop being left behind. I responded with a text rather than a formal RSVP. "Yes, but dinner only. I'll arrive at 5, leave by 8. Let's start small and see how it goes." Boundaries, I'd learned, didn't have to be announced with fanfare. They could be stated simply and held firmly, two qualities that often mattered more than the volume at which you delivered them. Thanksgiving evening arrived cold and clear, the kind of November night where stars are visible and breath comes out in clouds. I drove to Mom and Dad's house with 2 folders on my passenger seat. Metaphorical bookends to a journey that had started with a burgundy manila folder exactly 1 year ago. The first folder was cream-colored, labeled in my neat block printing, "Paid in full." Inside was Kayla's final restitution payment received the previous week, 10 months ahead of the court-ordered schedule. She'd actually opened a small online boutique selling vintage-inspired jewelry, built it with her own savings and a small business loan that she'd qualified for herself after completing the financial counseling program. The business wasn't thriving, her quarterly reports showed modest profit that barely covered her expenses, but it was surviving, and more importantly, she was learning. Learning to read contracts, to track expenses, to understand that money flowing out needed to be matched by money flowing in, or the whole thing collapsed. The second folder was blue thicker, containing something I'd spent 3 months preparing. Grandma May's handwritten recipes, every single one from her wooden recipe box, painstakingly photographed, and then hand-copied by me onto quality cardstock, 1 complete set for each family member who would be at dinner tonight. Her pot roast with the secret ingredient she'd never written down, but that I'd learned by watching. Her apple pie with the crust technique that required cold hands and patience. Her Christmas cookies that appeared every December like edible tradition. When she died, the recipes had stayed in Ruth's possession, and I'd realized that memory dies when it isn't preserved, when it isn't deliberately passed forward to hands that will carry it into the future. I arrived at 5 o'clock, exactly neither early nor late, and carried both folders to the front door. Mom opened it before I could knock, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the threshold. Then she stepped back and let me in, and the house smelled exactly the way it always had on Thanksgiving: turkey and sage, and something sweet baking that was probably the cranberry sauce Kayla had mentioned. The gathering was smaller this time, only 8 people instead of the 12 who'd been present for the vote a year ago. The ones who'd raised their hands but never apologized weren't here Uncle Jim. Aunt Susan, Cousin Derek, and a few others had apparently not been invited or had declined to come. What remained was a core of people who'd done the harder work of acknowledging what had happened and their part in it. I placed both folders on the dining room table before we sat down to eat. The cream one labeled Paid in Full sat on top of the blue one full of recipes. The room went quiet as people noticed them, understanding without explanation that these objects carried meaning beyond their physical form. No one asked me to make a speech. No one needed to. The folder said everything that needed saying: debts cleared, heritage preserved, past honored, future possible. The smell of roasted turkey mixed with the sound of the wall clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock that had marked time through the vote a year ago, time measured but no longer weaponized. Dad stood before we began eating, his hands visibly shaking as he gripped the back of his chair. "I want to say something before we start." His voice cracked slightly. "This family spent a lot of years thinking that love meant control and that loyalty meant keeping quiet about problems. We thought Miranda's strength meant she didn't need support, and we thought Kayla's struggles meant she needed endless rescue. We were wrong about all of it." He paused, swallowed hard. "Miranda taught us that real love has boundaries, and real loyalty requires honesty even when honesty is uncomfortable. Especially then." Mom reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing gently, and I squeezed back. Kayla stood then, and I saw she was holding a baby I hadn't yet met, except in photos, 7 months old. Dark hair eyes that looked around the room with the alert curiosity of someone discovering the world one moment at a time. "This is May," Kayla said, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in years. "Named after Grandma. I want her to grow up knowing her Aunt Miranda, the real one. Not the person I pretended you were when I needed you to be a villain in the story I was telling myself." She walked around the table and held out the baby, and I took her, feeling the solid weight of a life that held no judgment, carried no history, owed no debt. Just a child being held by her aunt, present moment curiosity, and the kind of trust that hasn't yet learned reasons not to trust. In that weight, I felt everything. I'd lost the year of exile, the damage to relationships, the nights wondering if I'd done the right thing, and everything I'd reclaimed, which was harder to quantify, but felt something like dignity, like the ability to look at myself in mirrors without flinching. The evening unfolded quietly after that. We ate turkey and stuffing and the cranberry sauce that did actually taste better than I remembered. We passed dishes and made small talk and washed dishes together afterward, everyone finding their place in the kitchen's choreography the way families do when they've done something together enough times that it becomes muscle memory. No one made grand speeches about forgiveness or reconciliation. We just existed in the same space without fighting, which felt like enough for now. I left at 7:53, 7 minutes before my stated boundary of 8 o'clock, because boundaries don't bend for sentiment or the temptation to stay just a little longer. As I drove home through November darkness, I passed the sign I'd had installed 6 months ago marking the entrance to May's Preserve. The community garden was dormant now, beds mulched and ready for winter, but I could see in my headlights the small shed where tools were stored, and the bench where people sat to rest while tending their plots. Everything I'd fought for had been to protect this not land measured in property values, but space where memory could live and community could grow things together. I thought about Grandma's letter from the tin box, the one that had started all of this. "Don't let them take what's yours, but don't let winning turn you into stone." I'd managed both, somehow kept what mattered, and kept my heart soft enough to feel the difference between justice and revenge, between boundaries and walls, between protecting yourself and punishing everyone around you for requiring protection. My phone buzzed at a red light. Ruth's text contained just 3 words, "Proud of you." I smiled, typed back, "Thank you," and drove the last few blocks to my house. I unlocked my door, the smart lock I'd installed after the rock through the window, the security I'd built, after learning that safety isn't something you assume, but something you construct deliberately, and stepped into my quiet house. My house. My choice. My life rebuilt from the foundation up, according to specifications I'd written myself. Later that evening, I made an apple pie using Grandma's recipe, the one I'd copied for everyone else, but also kept for myself. When the oven timer chimed and the pie finished baking golden and perfect and filling the house with the smell of cinnamon and memory, I finally sat down at a table I'd chosen for myself. That table, the one I chose for myself, taught me something that all the courtrooms and legal documents and family confrontations couldn't. Peace isn't something you inherit, or something that's given to you by people who finally decide you're worthy of it. Peace is something you build with your own hands, one boundary at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of saying no, not this, followed by yes, but only this much. A year after that second Thanksgiving, Mays Preserve hosts summer concerts, where families spread blankets on grass that used to be measured in development potential and is now measured in memories being made. The heating fund continues expanded now to include cooling assistance during brutal summer heat waves because I learned that protection shouldn't be seasonal. Kayla's boutique grew enough that she hired her first employee, a young woman who reminds me of myself at 22, eager and trusting and still learning that documentation protects you better than hope. Mom and Dad visit once a month now, always calling first, always respecting the boundaries that used to feel like punishment, but now feel like the structure that makes relationship possible. I still keep records. I still document important conversations. I still read every contract twice before signing. But these habits aren't paranoia anymore. They're simply wisdom, the kind you earn by paying tuition in the school of hard experience. And when people ask me how I survived that year, how I managed to stand firm when everyone I'd ever loved was lined up against me, I tell them the truth. I survived because I finally understood that being the strong one doesn't mean carrying everyone else's weight until you collapse. It means being strong enough to set things down when they're not yours to carry. The burgundy folder from that Thanksgiving dinner sits in a fireproof safe in my closet now, not because I expect to need it again, but because some things deserve to be preserved as evidence that you were right to trust yourself when everyone else said you were wrong. Next to it sits the blue folder of Grandma's recipes, because memory and justice both require the same thing, careful preservation, and the courage to use what you've saved when the moment demands it. So if you're sitting at a table right now wondering if you're the problem, wondering if maybe you should just be more flexible, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice what you need, so that other people can have what they want, let me tell you what I wish someone had told me 20 years ago. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave the table, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is build your own. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping yourself? Have you been the person everyone expected to sacrifice without complaint? Drop your story in the comments below. This community is built on people who understand that boundaries aren't walls. They're bridges to better relationships. And if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Every week I share stories about people who chose themselves without losing their humanity, who fought for justice without becoming cruel, who learned that love without respect isn't love at all. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that might be exactly what you need to hear. Your story matters. Your boundaries matter. And you matter more than anyone's comfort with your compliance. I'll see you in the next one.